Section 44 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 44. A cheerless and untidy room awaited him in Zeichenhof, and when he had taken some food from the pan set on the slovenly table, the young man became a prey to gloomy reflections. He almost regretted that in order to be alone he had sent off the garrulous and inquisitive old woman to the kitchen. All the incidents of the terrible fight came back to him with intense vividness. He could hardly endure the remembrance of the cavalry officer whom he had killed, and over again saw the unfortunate man falling from his horse. He heard again the cries for help, the piteous entreaties for quarter of the soldiers who spoke in the dialect of this country. They had found little mercy. Hundreds of them had been shot, slaughtered, crushed, drowned. The shrieks of the man under torture in the dark night, his moaning and sobbing, shrilled in his ears again, mingled with the song, "Our thoughts are free." Trivial things that he had noticed in the midst of the horrors recurred to his memory. The butterfly which had settled on the blood-besprinkled grass and pushed its proboscis into the red drops, the lad who had trodden on the body of a Bavarian and shook with laughter, the evil sound of which he heard again. God, what had the cavalry officer done to him, or the gunner, or the poor devils into whose curled-up bodies he had discharged his musket? He forced himself to think of the awful doings reported from Schwaz. Perhaps one might regard oneself as an instrument of the vengeance of God. How completely his life had changed within a few months. What had become of his buoyant spirits, his joy in mere living? Was his hair not turning grey in the heyday of his youth? A senseless, hopeless love had taken possession of his heart, and he had been caught into a wild whirl of eerie happenings. He had murdered, and he now understood Christian Lurgatforer, and knew how that poor soul felt. The sufferings of the good-natured creature were revealed to him, and he must now call upon his own strength to resist the face of the dead who had fallen at his hand, because someone had bidden it. And one outside there, on the wall of this dark, dreary house, was sounding on his fife the measure to which everyone must step, everyone. There was none who would not have to join in that dance. When he woke out of his melancholy reverie, it was beginning to grow dark. He had often amused himself at this hour with Butz, and could still fancy that he felt the animal's cold nose thrusting itself inside his hand. Alas, even the dog had left him. The floor creaked. He almost cried out for happiness. It was a miracle. Julia stood before him. "I am so glad," she said softly, laying her small hand on his shoulder. "You have returned." He was about to spring up, but the girl's hand gently pressed him back into his chair. "I want you to stay where you are." She smiled and took a seat on a carved chest at some distance from him. "I came up and no one saw me. That is well. So you are here again." She raised her arm for a moment as though she were about to reach it out to him, but at once her beautiful brows contracted, and she looked earnestly into his face. "Why are you so sad?" she asked. Yes, I am sad, Julia," he said, and his head sank. "I have had terrible experiences. I shot a young officer, Julia." "I suppose it could not be avoided." "Yes, it could," he said shortly. "My question was a thoughtless one." She shook her head slowly. "Everything that happens must happen. It will pass, Herr Stork. You will forget." He rose and reached for the lamp. "Oh, no," she begged. "This twilight is pleasant, and I am so glad that you have come back." He took a step towards her, and his heart began to beat more quickly. "Are you playing with me, Julia?" he cried. "Did you not know how hard it was for me to wait, how I longed for you? And yet you allowed me to suffer." "Well, I am here now," she answered gently. "I have come to you, as I promised." "Julia," he cried, overcome by emotion, "be kind to me at this hour. Explain the riddles that surround you and that torture me. Who are you? What are you in search of? In this corner of the world, and in this awful time of insurrection, Do you not understand how all that concerns you affects me too? What am I to think of your intimacy with these outlaws, that you, pure as you are, should make a companion of a wild thing of the woods like Sylvana, a little lighter love, or of that half-savage smith, or the queer little pitch-gatherer? And the flowers, where did the flowers come from that you left on the road? She rose, her face pale in the darkness. You promised me. I can't keep that promise, he went on passionately. Understand, my old uncle has disappeared inexplicably, and his disappearance is somehow connected with these supposed mountain beings whom they call the fire spirits. And it is becoming clearer and clearer to me, Julia, that you know more about these spirits and their strange doings than anyone else in Saint Maraine. Perhaps they are riddles, she said after a pause, but by all that I hold sacred, I swear to you, they relate to things which you may regard with indifference. Believe that, Herr Stork. And your uncle? She stopped short. My uncle? He caught her trembling hand. Speak, Julia, speak this moment. Perhaps there will not be such a moment again. I cannot, she said, her hand still trembling in his. I must not speak. But think no more of the fire spirits, I beg of you. They are harmless, and none of them has done any injury to your uncle. Now I know that you are one of those who are hostile to me, he said sadly. On the very first day I received a threat. A warning? Tell me then, who sent it? He urged. Someone who knew that you would enter on forbidden paths, like that hunter. Whom they nearly murdered, he interrupted bitterly. The blame was his, she spoke in a low tone. Why does he not leave people alone who are doing no harm? Why does he insist on knowing things which need not trouble him? Well, I mean to know these things too, Julia. No, do not. I beg it of you, earnestly. Her eyes filled with tears. He caressed her hair softly. Why are you concerned about me, Julia? A sob came from her lips, and with a sudden movement she laid her hand lightly on his face and touched his mouth with her lips. Oh, ti tien sha, I sun tien, she breathed in a scarcely audible whisper, but as quickly she shrank away, motioning him back with her hand. I must go at once, she faltered. We shall see one another again. He held her firmly. Not till I know what you just said now in some foreign speech for the second time, Julia. It's nothing, she cried, turning away her face. Let me go. She freed herself from his arms and ran to the door. Like a shadow, silently, she had vanished. In spite of the disenchantment of her departure, a feeling of blissful happiness remained with him. She loved him. There was no longer any doubt. She loved him and had been troubled about him, and despite the gloomy secret that hovered over her head and over her life, the certainty filled him with blessedness. Sweetest and dearest, he thought, I will not rest until I know what it is that fills your little heart with trouble. Neither wood devils nor fire spirits shall prevent me. Was it not as if the touch of her cool hand had redeemed him from blood guiltiness? His trouble had left him, the scenes of horror had paled away. How remote they had become all at once, as if the fight had happened years before, an event of which he could now think without special emotion. He could not remain in his room. As he left the house, a brilliant shooting star passed with its trail of gold over the dark sky. It was said that a wish formed at this moment would surely be fulfilled. Well, may she be mine, he exulted. Once again he was young. His years danced lightly onward, and the load of care which had oppressed him since the previous day fell from him. The end of section 44. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 45 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 45. A group of peasants, who no doubt would have preferred to be celebrating the victory, were standing in front of the rows, beside the sobbing barmaid and Christiane's niece, who was likewise in tears. "Well, we'll go to Jossel, he'll give us a glass of brandy," said Hornhouse, spitting on the ground. "It's all up with the innkeeper." "What's the matter with him now?" asked Peter, going up to the girls. They pointed to the entrance, unable to speak. The men shrugged their shoulders and slowly took themselves off. "What can anyone do?" one of them muttered. "The priest isn't allowed to come any more." Peter entered at once by the gloomy doorway and laid his hand on the latch of the tap-room door, but it was closed and would not open. A high falsetto voice could be heard within, laughing, talking, singing. Had the innkeeper some woman with him? Peter put his ear to the door. He could distinguish nothing but a moan of anguish. He knocked resolutely and called the innkeeper by name, saying he had brought some important news. But the strange chattering began again, and there was no answer. He bent his shoulders against the door and pushed with all his might, until the bolt-catches broke out of the decaying door-frame, and he himself almost fell on the ground as the door flew open. No unusual sight met his eyes. Nevertheless, he felt a chill of horror in his spine. Christiane Lergetforer was sitting in shirt and trousers, a half-burned candle on the table in front of him. In his face was a peculiar expression of childish joy, and his large blue eyes were gazing vacantly and without consciousness. He was moving his hands about in the air and talking incessantly, sometimes loudly, then hardly above his breath, with a thin, whimpering boy's voice, which was broken suddenly by weeping. "Christiane, what for God's sake are you about?" Peter shouted to him. "Don't you know me?" The two girls pressed in behind him, but the innkeeper did not appear to notice them, and kept on chattering and moaning. Gradually one picked up the drift of his talk. "You think I can't make my elbows meet on my back? Then do you suppose they'd have made me a drummer if I couldn't? And I can always do the flourish on parade better than Emile. Only there's one of my shoes I can't find. It was too big, and flew off when the Tyrolese man shot me. It was in the head he shot me, it was. And now at night I have to go about without the shoe, and you can only hear one foot tapping, tap, 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 when everything is quiet. The sergeant bought that fat old woman of his a red petticoat. He pinched her money for it, and 10 pounds of suet, and a new hat. I don't feed with her now, though she only charges 2 kreuses a day. You know how she goes on. Come here, pretty drummer, sit here. My old man's no good to me. You know the way the fat old toad is gone on the boys. Come, Ray, let's have a song. You'll join in, won't you? Now then. I was a drummer bold. They took me from the vault. Yes, from the vault. If I had stayed a drummer, I never would have come here. No, never come here. Now the second verse." Peter could bear it no longer. He went over to Christiane, his knees quaking, caught him by the arm and shook him. "Christiane, dear Christiane, wake up!" But the innkeeper only smiled and clumsily stroked the hand which had seized him, saying, "It's not Reveille yet, Corporal, and I must have another quarter of an hour's sleep, and I'm still singing. O gallows built so high, how fearful 'gainst the sky you look to me." A convulsive sob interrupted the song. The big man flung his 2 arms on the table, laid his head on them, and wept wildly. Neither word nor touch could soothe him. Peter turned in dismay to the terrified girls. "We shall have to get a doctor," he said, though as he spoke he knew that no doctor could help the unfortunate man. "He never lets anyone near him," whispered the niece. "He keeps his gun loaded on the bench beside him. Jossel's wife was here. She might cure the sickness, and the priest too. But everyone runs away when he turns up his eyes and reaches for the gun." "Then one of you must stop with him and see that he doesn't hurt himself," said Peter. Both the girls cried out and crossed themselves. "You stay, Moidle." "Who, I? And let the spirit get hold of me?" As Peter went out, He heard them quarrelling. They were terrified, and refused to remain in the house overnight. The end of Section 45. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 46 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 46. Tired to death, he sank on his bed. Next day, early in the morning, he went to Federspiel. The hunter was up, limping about in his room, pale and in ill humour. A kettle, in which soup was boiling, hung over a glowing fire on the hearth. "Where is Sylvana?" asked Peter, looking round the room. "It's neat and cosy here today. She worked for a while, and then we went to bed. She must have climbed over me this morning early. I didn't hear her get up. But there's soup there. To think of her going off again! She lay beside me all night, as snug as a purring cat." Peter sat down on a rickety chair and watched Federspiel pouring the milk pottage into a bowl. The hunter took 2 wooden spoons out of a drawer and made a gesture of invitation. "I breakfasted already, thank you," said Peter, and continued. "There's a sentence in a foreign language which I should like to know the meaning of. Eo tai tien cha eo sunt tien. What may that mean?" The other looked at him out of half-closed eyes. "That's a more affectionate phrase than the one you found on the paper in your window. Happy man to whom a pair of rosy lips say, 'I love you, I am yours.'" Peter felt that he was blushing. "It wasn't said to me." The little room with the antlers, the poor furniture, and the bearskin widened out to rosy, gilded distances. Silver bells sounded, but the hunter's mocking voice broke in. "All the same, I am pleased to find that you have learned by heart the language of love." 2 shrewd, clear blue eyes smiled at Peter as he blushed again. "Lergetfora's illness is taking a bad turn," said Peter, to cover his confusion, and he told what had happened on the previous evening at the inn. Federspiel fed himself slowly from his spoon and said, "The poor devil has had too soft a heart all his life. I remember it well how he cried like a child, over his old dog Tiras. The dog was sick and was in such pain that it howled all night through, and at last it was resolved that I was to shoot him. The dog suspected nothing, and I made a speedy end of him and buried him in the field. But, my God, the state Christian was in! And now that affair of the little drummer boy. He'll never get over it. The people say he's possessed." The hunter brought the palm of his hand down on the table so violently that everything rattled. "We both heard yesterday what that ox Vogelsanger thought about it, but that you, Herr Stork, should be the next. His mind is out of order, that's all." "But it comes to much the same thing," argued Peter, "whether you call it by this name or that." "But the name you give the disease, Herr Stork, is not the right name to give it among these superstitious people. Names like that do mischief. Don't you know that there have been several cases of possession here? Go into our church and have a look at the big picture there. An obligation rests on men like you and me to talk the people out of such nonsense. Is there not enough darkness in their peasant skulls? If only I succeed in beating up the fire spirits, I hope a great deal from that. For they'll see then how much the thing has to do with spirits. And, Herr Stork," he added with a sharp glance, "don't lose your wits even if there's a sound of angels' music. Mice are caught with bacon, and men with love." "Herr Federspiel," cried Peter, starting up, "what does that mean?" The hunter sat unmoved. "I don't like using many words to avoid saying the right one. In that respect I'm a German. Plainly, then, they have sent the little brown wood fox to me, and to you something more elegant and beautiful." "This I cannot allow, sir," said Peter angrily. "The lady whom you—" "Gently." Federspiel rested his hand on Stork's upraised arm. "Are we going to cross swords here like students? The fact that you asked me about the sentence explained everything to me. Something dainty and distinguished is provided for you, though the little brown wench is good enough for Seraphine Federspiel. Don't fly out, Herstalk. This is no time for drawing-room compliments. It's a matter of life and death. We will take it, then, that, so far as you are concerned, they have succeeded in causing you to desist from our common purpose, and to leave the fire spirits undisturbed. My foot is a reminder to me of the plans we meant to carry out together. Peter had a feeling of sickness. Was it possible that Julia? He dismissed the thought. That noble maiden was not false. He was too firmly convinced that it was her anxiety about himself that had brought her to him. Once more Federspiel seemed to read his thoughts. "Understand me well," he said more gently. "I don't wish to revile anyone whom you respect, but I should be disappointed, bitterly disappointed, if for the sake of a pair of fine eyes and a sweet voice you should cease to acknowledge any obligations to your uncle. What I tell you once more, his disappearance has to do with the fire spirits. I can't prove it, but a feeling which does not deceive me tells me it is so. And she has been trying to dissuade you from seeking them out, exactly as my little rogue has been doing with me, for she could not chatter enough about how careful I ought to be in climbing the mountains so much, and taking paths on which death is waiting. It's the same thing with both of them. The fire spirits are sending us a message by them." Peter stood for some time, troubled and silent. Then he spoke. "A man worth his salt goes through with the job he has taken in hand, or comes to grief over it. Here's my hand. I'm with you wherever it brings us, and I will allow no one to divert me from it. Only no more about the young lady." "Yes, yes," smiled the other. "We are full of good intentions, we two. But we can't leave alone the one thing which is wine and fragrance to us in the desert. Neither you nor I, though we both know well that it takes the strength from us. Well, I think I'll go down with you now to Christiane." Things were not so bad at the inn as Peter had feared. Christiane seemed to have got rid of his nightly visitant. His face looked shrunken and as if he had not slept, but there was nothing unusual in what he said. He was drinking with a couple of musketeers who were trying to convince him of the retreat of Marshal Lefebvre. Peter and Federspiel, now in high favour for having taken their share in the fight at Pontlatz, were pressed to sit down and drink a health in the dark red wine of the country. The brave fellows appeared to be highly pleased. There was to be an end now to the greed of their enemies. Andreas Hofer was firmly established in the imperial castle at Innsbruck, and was really governing. The aristocrats, indeed, looked sulky, and the shameless women were being taught at last to dress modestly, while the over-clever professors were obliged to yield their places to good scholarly priests. All was well with the people generally, only in the south a storm was brewing, and French regiments were joining up in Italy. There were others at the table who did not seem disposed to indulge in boastful speeches, and had anxious faces. They had heard too often the cry that all was over, yet all the terrors of war had returned. They were tough, these foreign devils, and however many were killed, there were always more of them. "How are you today, Christiane?" asked Peter in an undertone. The innkeeper looked at him as if he did not understand. "Who? I am always better in the daytime." A sudden distress flickered in his eyes. "Wine helps. It makes a man forget." And he gulped down the liquor in his glass. "Hurrah for Tyrol!" exclaimed the man who had been bragging, throwing his hat on the table. "Fetch me another glass, my pet, my darling." The barmaid screamed as he tried to get hold of her, and ran off with the empty bottle. Then they sang the song. "Thoughts are free. Though deep in a dungeon my body they bind, where help cannot reach me, and no friend can find, yet the spirit within me my freedom shall win me, through iron and stone, our thoughts are our own." After this they went off, laid aside their muskets and powder-horns, put on their everyday clothes, and applied themselves cheerfully to their peasant labours, faithful to the niggardly soil for which so many of them had given up their lives. The end of section 46. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 47 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 47. In the bright morning, Peter went into the garden of Zeichenhof, about which he had not as yet troubled himself, and surveyed with some remorse the fruit trees, which were in urgent need of care and cultivation, trying to remember anything he had learned which might help him. Nests of caterpillars hung on the branches. Some were devouring the leaves in which they had wrapped themselves. It was time that he should give more attention to his estate than heretofore. In the first place, he held it in trust, and he might have to render an account for it. The fir wood, too, in which the resin-gatherer had been allowed to bark the trees without supervision, he determined to visit during these quiet days. It might even happen that Zeichenhof would acquire a mistress. The thought was too sweet not to bring with it anxious doubts. Did she really love him? The poison instilled by Federspiel's words worked in him, and gradually a dark veil closed over the golden dream. There was a rustling sound in one of the old apple trees. He went over to it and caught sight of two red, naked legs, struggling upwards and disappearing amongst the branches. It was Sylvana, endeavouring to hide from him. He could not help laughing, and took hold of her by the feet. A green apple with a bite out of it dropped in his face, and thereupon he seized her and dragged her down, screaming. "I have you now, you little thief," he laughed. "Now I'll put you through your catechism, wildcat." She looked up into his face and laughed. "Where is the beautiful young lady, that I never see her?" he asked more seriously, for the windows in the smith's house were closed. "Where is she? Gone to Sprug, Innisbrook. You can run after her," she said mockingly, trying with all her strength to escape his grasp. Suddenly he let her go. "You scratched too!" he cried, rubbing his hand. "Why did you hurt me then with your rough paws?" she asked angrily. "What do I care about your young lady?" "Why are you so cross with me, Sylvana?" he coaxed her. "Would you like me to bring you upstairs?" She smiled and pressed close to him. "I'd love it," she cried, her eyes sparkling. "But you'll have to steal up and not let the housekeeper hear you," he warned her. "I don't want to set people talking." She nodded knowingly and stole after him without a sound. The study, with its numerous bright-coloured, curious and glittering objects about the room and round the walls, put her into an ecstasy of delight. She examined everything critically, sniffing with her small freckled nose and feeling with her hands whatever she could reach. He looked on with pleasure, while with a little cry of delight she put out her hands to feel a shining crystal, or a coloured glass, a speckled bird's egg, or a metal bowl, next moment discovering a silver sugar-caster or a silk cushion. "Give me that!" she cried, and could not herself have said what her choice was. At last he drew her attention to something which made her giddy with excitement. It was a small musical box, with a lid that could be lifted off, allowing one to see the cogged brass cylinder and bright steel tongues of the works. When a little lever was pressed down, a minuet of Mozart began, clear and fine, like fairy music. It seemed as though the birds painted on the gilded porcelain of the little box were twittering. "Oh, oh!" she cried, and put down the singing treasure on the floor, beside herself with delight. When the music ceased, he showed her how to place a small key in the body of a bluebird and bring the creature to life again. She sprang up, and before he could stop her, stripped her body of her chemise and petticoat, and stood before him quite naked, pretty as a little elf. "Am I not nice?" she cried enticingly, dropping her head to one side. "Look at me!" "I saw you once before like that, Sylvana." She looked at him with wide eyes and put her hand to her small bosom. "This?" She smiled. "Just as you are now, beside the spring in the wood up there," She uttered a cry. "You are lying!" "You, and the lovely Julia, and your brother. And you danced." A cloud gathered on her bold little face. She took up the box from the floor and banged it on the table so that the works rang. Silently she slipped on her chemise and tied her short petticoat round her slim hips. "You saw her naked," she said in a dull tone. "Yes, sir." He repented keenly his indiscretion, but it was now too late. "And you, too?" "Then God dies," she stammered in horror. "Oh, misery!" She threw herself on the couch and burst into a wild fit of weeping. "Sylvana!" He was much moved and caressed the sobbing girl. "What is that you say? Who must die?" "God dies," she wept. He raised his hand to his forehead. What was the child thinking of? "Sylvana, my dear little witch," he said, sitting down beside her, "why do you call the young lady the Sun Maiden? Tell me, and I will give you the musical box." She half rose, and supporting herself on one arm, looked at him with eyes that had grown dark. "You have entered forbidden paths," she murmured, with a sadness which seemed foreign to her. "You have brought death." "Speak now, Sylvana. Take what you like. Look about in the room for what you most desire. But tell me what you know. You called yourself once a raven, and your brother talked about himself as a hidden one. And then some time ago you had a red flower in your hair, which does not grow anywhere about here. You are clever, Sylvana, and you can easily explain everything to me if you choose. And if you will only tell me what Fraulein Julia has to do with you—" She spat at him like a wild cat and cried, "I'll tell you nothing, nothing, do you hear? Not if you give me everything in your fine house. You may burn me alive, but I'll tell you nothing. Never, never." He saw that he had not taken the right way to obtain the knowledge he wanted. "Very well, then, tell me nothing, Sylvana," he resumed. "The box with the birds and music is yours all the same." A slight smile passed over her face. "And you let me keep it?" she asked. "You won't take it back?" "No, little Sylvana, I make you a present of the box." She ran to the table, pressed the box tenderly to her heart, holding it in both her hands. "Won't you—" She uttered an ugly word which she had no doubt picked up from some fellow. "No, Sylvana," he said, almost saddened by the thought of all this childish creature seemed to know. "I want nothing from you." Her eyes sank. "I know why you don't want me. You love her." "Sylvana?" "Yes, you love her, and she loves you, and that means death." He was now really startled. "I demand nothing from you," he said hastily, "but you have now for the second time spoken of death. I must know what that means, and I ask you, dear Sylvana, to tell me. You are a little woman yourself, and you must know how one feels when one loves anybody. You, too, must love someone better than anyone else. I don't know who it is." "It's Seraphine," she said, and her cheeks grew darker. "Well, if someone were to tell you that Seraphine Federspiel must die, would not you, too, ask why?" "He must soon die," she whispered. "He said so himself. I often cry about it." Her eyes were full of tears, and her mouth was drawn as if she were about to weep. "Don't cry, don't cry." Peter tried to console her. "Seraphine may be quite well again. No one need sentence him to death." "You are good." She smiled and stroked his hand. "As for the others, I don't care. But Seraphine, I love him more than anything in the world." "Then you can understand, Sylvana. Who is it threatens Julia?" he asked anxiously. She looked at him and appeared to be struggling with herself, but presently she said, gently and hesitatingly, "No one is threatening her. I will tell you this much only. There's a saying among those who have knowledge. If the purity of the Sun Maiden receives a stain, then God dies." Was it really a child who thus gravely and in well-ordered words touched on a secret of which the deeper meaning must not be betrayed? He was now convinced that a number of the people in the district were sworn members of a brotherhood which required the strictest secrecy among its initiates, and followed up inexorably anyone who attempted to penetrate to its mysterious activities. What lay hidden behind these strange designations, these nocturnal fires on the mountain heights, these dances in secret places? What manner of god was it that was subject to death? The girl stood before him. She pressed the musical box close to her bosom, and her eyes were fixed longingly and uneasily on the door. "Run away, then," he forced a laugh. She made a step towards him, raised herself on her toes in order to reach his ear, and whispered, "They all know that you are spying on them, you and Seraphine." And immediately, like some wild animal, she ran from the room. It was time for her to do so, for just then old Herlander appeared with the tablecloth. The end of section 47. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 48 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 48. That evening, Peter, filled by a sad longing for Julia, suddenly remembered his uncle's old book, locked away in the writing table, as if it had been an important bequest, instead of standing with the hundreds of other books, many of which had titles indicating curious contents. He took the treasury from the drawer in which it had slumbered so long, with its instructions in alchemy, cures for gout, and strange reminders of an age of hardy toping, and tried once again to discover some hint in the passages marked with red, anticipating failure, ere he began. He had essayed this vain task too often, bending over the mouldy pages with throbbing temples, and never discovering the slightest significance in the order of the printed passages. This time, too, he succeeded no better, and after worrying over the book for an hour, he threw it impatiently on the table. His eyes smarted, and he walked up and down the room exhausted. Then he noticed something which immediately excited him. The book had fallen in such a way that it lay open with a single leaf standing upright, through which the lamplight shone faintly, and in the middle of the paper, thus rendered transparent, appeared little bright golden points. He started and looked closer. Yes, this must be it. Under single letters in the lines the paper had been pierced by a fine needle, and through these tiny apertures the lamplight passed. The solution! This might be the solution! With a feverish hand he smoothed out the page. The letters marked with the needle point belonged to lines in the paragraph in which directions for the crab trick were given, and this paragraph was indicated in red on the margin. Hastily, Peter took ink and paper, turned the pages to the first of the indicated passages, and dipped his quill. His eyes swam. It was not always easy to find the perforation, which was close under the individual letters, but with much care he succeeded in not neglecting any of them. Letter ranged itself beside letter on his writing-sheet, and at last the sentence which his vanished uncle had left as the sole news of himself was written out clear and distinct before him. "If you will unveil the secret, pierce into the heart of the mountain. The stream will show the road to the bold." Deeply stirred, he sat with what he had written before him. Did death wait at the end of this road? Had his uncle taken it? The thought of brooding there through a sleepless night was intolerable. He extinguished the lights quickly, stole out of the house, and groped his way slowly in the moonless cloudy night to where Fetterspiel's hut lay still and dark. Nothing was to be heard but the noise of the stream rushing eternally from the mountain to the valley. After a stealthy search, he found above a pile of sticks the little window behind which the hunter slept. He knocked softly. A sigh came from the room, a muttering as of one roused out of a deep sleep. The bed creaked. "Is that you, Sylvana?" "It's I, Stork," called Peter in a low voice. "I must speak to you at once." The hunter rose slowly and came to the door. The bolt was drawn back with a clatter. There was a stifling odour in the room. The steel rang on the flint, sparks started in the tinder, and a blue flame spurted up, emitting a pungent smell. At length the oil wick was lit. Peter carefully closed the door. He hung a cloak over the window, then turning to the hunter, who was blinking sleepily at the yellow light, said abruptly, "I have discovered the secret. I have it." Federspiel's eyes flashed. "Is it true?" "There's no mistake." Peter drew forth the blotted sheet on which he had written, and held it under the lamp. It was not till the first light of dawn that Stork left the hunter's hut, having first looked out carefully to see that no one was about. He reached Zeitlinghof without meeting or seeing anyone. The cocks were crowing as he stretched himself in the cool sheets of his bed. "The attempt must be made at once," the hunter had said. The end of section 48. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 49 of the Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 49. On the second night following, they set forth cautiously on the expedition. The sky was overcast. There had been a slight fall of rain in the forenoon, and a mist hung about the giant heads of the mountains. It was 4 o'clock when they arrived at the bed of the stream. At first the way was difficult, and Federspiel groaned whenever it was necessary to use his injured foot in leaping, and there were plenty of leaps to be taken. The track had to be found from stone to stone by the edge of the roaring water. More than once the wounded man reeled as his ankle gave way under him. Both of them were wet to the waist from the spray. Peter almost compelled his limping companion to give him the knapsack, in which was a supply of rope, an axe, candles, and food. After several hundred paces, the path, though still narrow, became well defined and high enough to travel on, even when the stream was swollen. At the point where this part of the path began, Federspiel stood still and pointed to the grey and moist wall of rock. "It's just as I thought. There's an easy zigzag path from the top. You wouldn't notice where it begins in a thicket of juniper bushes away up there. Try it, and go up a little way." Peter obeyed, and ascended the path for a short distance until he saw that it wound upward regularly. He was turning to descend when the inside pocket of his coat, which lay open, caught in a thorny bush and was torn. He heard the noise of the rent, but did not allow himself time to look at it. "You were right. Quite an easy path," he reported to his companion. "That's the road which the fire spirits come down into the clam. It's up there that we see the lights at the time of the equinoxes, and it must have been about here that they found the shuffler." "He said something about devils," said Peter, remembering Christiane's story. "2 devils hunted me over the cliff," were his words. "Hornhaus made no mistake about it. 2 devils, and he also says that the shuffler was neither a fool nor a coward, and if he said there were 2 devils, there were 2 devils. And it's these devils, Herr Stork, that we're going to find out at their tricks." He shouted this in Peter's ear in order to be heard above the roaring of the stream by which they were standing. Then, silently, he took a double-barreled pistol from his inside pocket and showed it to his companion. "It's necessary to bring a little dog that can bite in affairs of this kind," he shouted. They went on. The clam grew narrow as the high walls of rock approached one another, and between these far overhead ran a thin grey ribbon of rainy sky, against which stood out the dark fledged trees growing at the edges of the terrible gulf. Something red vanished into the cliff as they gazed upwards, a fox, which no doubt had his hole there, and at length they stood in front of the monstrous door out of which the stream thundered. Some frightful force seemed to have split open the mountain here in the dawn of the ages. After the shock which had rent the huge masses apart, they had fallen together again, but had not closed up completely the cleft in the body of the mountain. The raging water had then no doubt swept away the debris in order to gain a clear passage, rolling down the blocks of rock in its way, turning them over in its eddies, and dragging them along with it. A broad and lofty door had been left, consisting of two monstrous fragments of rock which leaned against one another at their upper ends. In spite of their overwhelming weight, they vibrated beneath the unceasing assault of the mass of water which struck at their base. Speech here was impossible. It died in the tumultuous uproar which ascended from the abyss. Black and sinister opened before them the entrance into the underworld, and a vaporous spray blew against them out of the cavernous darkness. Federspiel took out a lantern from the knapsack which Peter was carrying, and after some attempts he succeeded in lighting the candle within the greenish glass. The tinder had become damp in the wet mist of the clam, and a feeble, flickering light threw some illumination on the wet walls of the passage and on the narrow path which they still followed. Federspiel pointed with sudden excitement to footprints visible in the clay. As they went on, a tepid air blew on them, and the hunter knelt down, motioning Peter to do the same. They held their hands in the rushing water, which was warmer than it had been outside, and the further they advanced, the clearer it became that from some direction hot springs found their way into the stream. Step by step, and often halting to light up the cavern, the hunter led on. Once the yellow gleam rested on a semicircular basin filled with clear water. The edges were formed by the limy droppings from the roof, and in the moist depth moved slim, rosy-tinged salamanders with inert, fleshy legs, frail-looking little animals, cave creatures never seen. A lateral passage opened out, and Federspiel stood irresolute, but the next moment he pointed with an excited gesture to a metal ring coated with rust at the entrance to this gallery, in which was still fixed the stump of a burnt pine torch. Here the path suddenly broadened out into a floor of fine sand marked with numerous footprints, large and small, nailed boots of men and the tracks of women's feet. The sides of the passage appeared to have been hewn with the pickaxe a long time previously. The turbulent water rushed by the entrance to the passage, and with every step they took forward the sound of it grew fainter, becoming at length a hollow murmur, like the deep sound of a choir heard in the distance. "We are on the right road," said Federspiel in an undertone, and pointed to the remains of some pine torches heaped in a niche at one side. "They climb down into the clam with these torches, and then come this way." Peter returned no answer. He was in a state of intolerable excitement. This, then, was the secret path taken by the rover, the pitch-gatherer, the Fentor brothers, and, alas, Julia herself, and little Sylvana, on those nights of the year when day and night were of equal duration. So far as this, or even farther, the vanished Martin Stork might have come before he entrusted his secret to the old book. And Julia? What was the lure of these secret assemblies which had the power to draw her, too, hither? Suddenly a great square cavern chamber opened in front of them. Federspiel directed the light towards a portion of the wall which gave back a white reflection, and uttered an exclamation of amazement. Peter came quickly to his side and stood still, staring fixedly, as if unable to move. In the faint gleam of the tallow candle, two human forms, brought to life by the flickering flame, rose out of the gloomy monotony of the rocky wall and gazed with empty eyes. The rover and Julia. Peter's heart was seized with fear and horror, but next moment he recognized the work of an artist. Two portraits in bas-relief, chiselled out of noble, even-toned marble, the sepulchral monument of a fully equipped Roman soldier and of a girl who leaned lightly on his mailed shoulder. Half-length portraits, executed with life-like perfection. Underneath, on a slab, was engraved an inscription commemorating the names and rank of the pair. Aemilian Sagittae Tribune, Legion I. Noricum et filia Julia. "A grave," whispered Federspiel, overwhelmed by the awfulness of the place, and he pointed almost fearfully to two stone urns in a small cavity below the monument. "The ashes." Peter gazed with painful emotion at the two heads, so dissimilar, and yet with certain likenesses to one another. Seen beside the hard, furrowed and clear-cut face of the old tribune, whose unbending will was revealed in the bold features and thin lips, the classically regular face of the daughter appeared to gain in beauty, with its haughty yet gentle mouth, the tender round cheeks, and the clear forehead. On the breast of the coat of mail worn by the old warrior, a snaky-locked Medusa head was represented, as if to accentuate the contrast. Aemilianus Sagittarius, tribune of the 1st Noric Legion, and his daughter, Julia, Federspiel read. Strange that living persons should resemble those who have long ago turned to ashes. Julia, called Peter with a choking voice. He reached out his hands helplessly to the motionless marble figure. This place makes me shiver, whispered Federspiel. It's not a place to loiter in. Peter, however, did not move, but stared with wide-open eyes, as if beside himself. Federspiel caught hold of him, called him by name, shook him. Peter started, uttered a deep sigh, and said, "We will go on." They turned away from the spectral heads and looked round them. Other urns, they now noticed, reposed in this sepulchral chamber. On a small stone the word Venator was cut, and involuntarily the two exclaimed in the same breath, Eritor. It sounded as if the old Latin word had suffered a simple alteration in the course of time. Ghosts slumbered in this place, at intervals awakening and abandoning their sepulchres, venturing into the village and dwelling amongst the people there. They found a kind of stone altar at one wall, almost breast-high, facing towards a human figure with the head of a lion. Perhaps in grey antiquity sacrifices had been offered here to the shades of the dead. In general the chamber was quite bare. There seemed to be no outlet from the gallery along which they had come. Out of one of the 4 walls opposite the entrance to the gallery projected an unhewn block of stone, separated from the surface of the wall by narrow clefts. "Once more let me look at the portraits," Peter was about to say, but the hunter's face suddenly took on an expression of the most strained attention, and with a motion of the hand he enjoined silence. Then he stepped back, quick as lightning, moistened his finger and extinguished the candle, grasped Peter by the arm, drew him into the darkness behind the altar, and pressed him to the ground. They cowered down, and Peter heard the words just breathed. "Here they come." A bright line of light, narrow as the blade of a knife, framed the block of rock in the wall, then spread out and lit up the sepulchral chamber. A humming sound was heard, a noise of rolling, followed by a heavy knock, as of stone colliding with stone. They did not dare to move. Immediately after, both of them saw a man advancing towards the opening of the gallery through which they had come. It was the rover. By the light of the earthenware lamp which he held in his left hand, they could see him distinctly. He wore the short red cloak in which Peter had once already seen him, short leather breeches, and coarse stockings. His right hand gripped his staff, fitted with a long, sharp iron point. Erect and with rigid countenance, bearing a startling resemblance to the figure in the wall, he strode past the altar, and immediately afterwards passed out of the entrance to the gallery, by which was the way out. Peter had heard with concern a groan from the hunter beside him, which gradually became more distressing. But it was not until he had ceased to hear the old man's footsteps, and the noise of the wild stream once more filled his ear, that Peter, who as yet did not dare to move, noticed a movement by his side, and guessed from the stifled and convulsive sounds which now began, that Federspiel, in due hunter fashion, had thrown his hat on the ground, and buried his face in it in order to relieve a bad fit of coughing. After some time, quite exhausted, the hunter managed to relight the candle. He was deadly pale, and large drops of sweat glistened on his forehead. There were dank, dark spots on the green hat. "I thought I would have burst," he gasped. "If he had stood still, I should have had to murder him," he broke out, still breathing heavily and spitting out blood on the sand. "Otherwise he would have run me through. I noticed his arms. Old as perhaps he is, he has terrible strength. But where did he come from so suddenly? I heard and saw the light over there. A moment later, and we would have been face to face with him." A low click drew Peter's attention to the fact that the other had lowered the cocks of his double-barreled pistol, which he had apparently been able to pull back without any sound. The hunter then turned his light on the block of stone. "That's the door," he said, feeling with his hands and trying in vain to move it. "That's where he got through." He made another attempt, but the massive block did not yield by a hair's breadth. "Well, we shall have to be satisfied for the present. The rest of the way is barred to us, but we'll try again, by all the tribunes, devils, and fire spirits. If we could only get through, we might set foot in that green meadow in the chamois garden." "Do you really think so?" asked Peter, who thought the assertion somewhat bold. "Have you forgotten that Andel and I saw the rover there below us? I know that he didn't get down over that awful shellbuck wall, and I'm convinced that we too ought to succeed in reaching the place the old man came from, and, by the same way, we'll follow him there, and before long." "It may mean our lives." "In that case I'll be dead a couple of months sooner," returned Fetterspiel with a grim smile. "But now let's get away before more of them come." "I want to see the sculptures once again," Peter begged of him, putting out his hand for the lantern. "Not on any account, Erstork," answered the hunter. "Things like that are bad for a man. I feel myself as if a lot of ancient evil eyes were peering at us out of the dark corners. Let us go." Without looking round to convince his friend, he returned to the passage, holding the unsteady light. Soon they were deafened once more by the roaring of the waters. The basin lay still, and they saw again the slim bodies of the salamanders. Cold drops fell from overhead, labouring patiently through the ages at the icicles of stone which hung from the roof with a white and yellow gleam. The damp air made the travellers shiver. Far in front of them appeared a star of bluish light, which spread out and became at length the door of the cavern. They looked cautiously out of the darkness and issued forth. Fetterspiel extinguished the feeble light. The end of section 49. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 50 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 50. When, far below the cavern, they had climbed out of the bed of the stream, they took a rest. "That terrible resemblance," murmured Peter half to himself. "People living on after they are dead." "Beware of superstitious thoughts, Erstork," said Fetterspiel earnestly. "Remember Christiane. We must not yield to any horrors. A stone figure may easily bear a resemblance to a person who has it constantly before him and in his mind. And faces like the old rovers and the Romans are often to be seen about here. Men with hawk heads like that are all just the same to look at. I know, there's a fascination in abandoning oneself to these imaginations, and in losing our senses in mysteries. But on that very account, reason must remain in further control, or a man will soon bewilder himself with illusions, and at last will not know the difference between sleeping and waking. We must be on our guard, Erstork, and beware of everything which clouds the senses. If it weren't so with us too, we would not be sitting here, and should still be devout believers in the fire spirits, like the people in the village. Once we have seen the end of this apparition of wretched souls on fire, we shall hear no more of miracles and spirits, and find that everything explains itself if we look at it boldly, without letting ourselves be fooled by the old woman's soul that exists in us all. Peter, however, had been too deeply moved to be reassured by these well-meant counsels. Though it was broad daylight round him, he felt as though unknown powers were drawing snares closer and closer about him, as though Some fatality were concealed in all that had so far befallen him. A formidable something stood between him and his beloved, threatening death and destruction, something inapprehensible and not to be reached by the ordinary processes of understanding. His sad gaze was fixed on a tussock of strange whitish grass amid the heather, on a round hillock not far from them. What kind of blades, thin and silvery, could lie over one another so curiously? "What sort of grass is that, the white patch yonder?" he asked the hunter, who was quietly devouring bread and bacon. The hunter looked, and his face clouded. "Rascals," he muttered, and then called aloud, "Ho, there! Won't you get up? I'm looking at you, old spy." The clump of grass began to move. An old head with 2 piercing eyes rose out of it, and a toothless mouth grinned.
"I was just having a fine sleep."
It was old Blasey. "Get away," said Federspiel mockingly. "So you just happened to make a choice of that spot." The pitch-gatherer, in his shiny black coat of mail, stood up with a crackling noise, and, as if he had heard nothing, observed,
"You are early abroad, gentlemen. Where may you have been, then?"
"I suppose you aren't even inquisitive," returned the hunter. "We were up in the heath yonder," and he pointed towards the Hockouf.
"Then the wind must have blown this onto the path down to the clam,"
grinned the pitch-gatherer, taking from his pocket a silken tassel, apple green and peach red. Peter started and felt for his Franconian pipe. The silken embellishments were missing. Then he remembered how, when he had climbed up the path at Federspiel's request, his coat had caught in the shrubs, and he had heard something tear. Federspiel looked on moodily as Blasey handed Peter the bright-coloured badge, and said with a smile,
"A gentleman should be more careful next time. Queer. The wind was coming up from the valley all the forenoon, and yet this thing was carried down here."
He wagged his wrinkled face and tittered. "You trouble yourself a great deal about what doesn't concern you," said the hunter shortly. The old man, who appeared exceedingly pleased, clapped his hand on his shining trousers, and sang in a thin, crowing voice,
"A snail inside her little cell was sure that none could view her. Then came old Father Gardener and said good morning to her."
He picked up his faded hat from the ground, cocked it on his white head, and went off with stiff knees in the direction of his hut. The hunter looked after him, raging. "They keep a curiously good lookout," he muttered to himself. "The spirits and I are going to come to grips soon." They said nothing more to one another, and separated when they came near the village. The end of Section 50. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 51 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 51. Unable to think of anything but the strange adventure in the cavern and the mysterious likeness of the stone figures, Peter stretched himself on his couch for an hour. How full of hope he had gone forth with the hunter after the discovery in his uncle's old book, filled with the delusion that he was about to unravel the enigma. And now the veils were multiplied, and the hope of lifting them had become more remote since it had been made plain that those who were in possession of the secret were on the watch. The following days, during which Federspiel was not to be seen, were passed in gloomy reveries. 10 times he found an excuse for going down to the village and staring up at Julia's closed window, but Julia was far away, and even a bold resolution to take her completely into his confidence and force an explanation from her was for the present idle. Vainly he sought to convince himself that it had been no more than his excited nerves which had suggested a resemblance between the marble maiden and the living Julia. Certainly her gracious face was always before him, but the shock with which, by the dim light of the lamp, he had recognized in the beautiful stone countenance a perfect representation of Julia's features had been so overwhelming that he could not dismiss the resemblance as a deception. Often he was near despair. Never, never would he succeed in winning out of this maze of riddles into a clear atmosphere. Perhaps, in truth, it was better to know nothing of the secret things that were done in these wild woods and gloomy mountain caverns. Then he remembered the page of manuscript which had been laid with the book. With what intention had Martin Stork preserved these single paragraphs on examples of possession, separating them from the rest of the scries to which they belonged? Was this indeed a place in which lurked unfortunate souls, waiting to find a new dwelling-place in human bodies? The nun yonder in the valley, the innkeeper, out of whom came at times the voice and the laugh of the drummer boy he had shot. It occurred to him suddenly that the hunter had spoken of a curious picture in the Sankt Marijn church. He started up at once and went off to the little church. The rusty iron gate of the churchyard groaned as he opened it, and as he passed the charnel house a whim took him to look at the skulls displayed there. They were ranged behind an iron grating, propped against one another and varying in shape, some decked with garlands of artificial roses or with pious texts inscribed on the white bone of the forehead. In the middle of the small arched chamber stood the parish hearse, and all round it the grave-digger had piled his winter supply of wood. Peter came out again into the sunlight and made his way to the church through sunken graves and slanting crosses. The door was open. Close beside it the greasy bell-rope hung from the roof. On the altar were ornamental pyramids of paper roses, blue, red, and violet, mingled with gold tinsel, and between these the emaciated figure of the Redeemer bowed its thorn-crowned head. Pleasing spots of colour were thrown from the windows along the benches, and near the altar hung the picture, crowded with figures, which he had come to look at. In the middle of an impossibly green meadow, from which, in the background of the picture, rose the church in which he stood, represented faithfully, a young girl knelt, supported by two men in peasant costume and a woman with a large cap. The girl wore an old-fashioned purple dress, and a priest in white cope and yellow stole was raising a crucifix in front of her, his left hand holding a little black book with red edges, in which his forefinger was inserted. A large company of people, all dressed in the same way, and with the same expression on their faces, men, women, and children, stood round in a circle, their hands folded in prayer. A small bristling monster, somewhat like a walrus with wings, was issuing from the girl's mouth in a cloud of blue smoke and yellow flame. The inscription below the picture had become scarcely legible, and with some difficulty Peter made out that the Christian maiden Lidwina Legatfora had in this place on July 6, 1682, been freed from a devil named Zorboth, and that her parents had presented this picture to commemorate the event. Peter stood for a long time before this rude representation, from which the colour was fading. The unfortunate child had been a Legatfora, and no doubt belonged to the family from which the innkeeper was descended. How strange that a man of her kindred should now be suffering from a similar spiritual ailment, and should believe that he harboured in his body a strange guest. Did the word ailment explain everything? The fact that Christiane kept talking in a way quite appropriate to a Bavarian drummer, the song that he sang in a shrill boy's voice during his nights of torture, when one weighed all the circumstances, was there not a residue of real mystery? Even though Federspiel was right in insisting that one should make no surrender to superstition, it was not easy to ignore such questions. And if unknown powers were at work in this case, was it not also possible that the soul of the tribune of the Noric Legion was lodged in the rover, and that of the tribune's daughter in Julia? Peter laughed suddenly at the aberrations in which he caught himself. Where would such fancies bring him if he began to yield to them? Was it not already a kind of madness to occupy one's mind with such thoughts? Superstition, he knew well, was infectious, and the beliefs which existed in the timid souls of the people of this district, nourished constantly by fear, in the presence of the inexplicable, and confirmed in them by their ignorance of the thousand possibilities of mental disturbance, were no doubt inherited from one generation to another, becoming at last articles of faith. And the Church had gradually allied itself with this faith, which thus, in a manner, sustained itself from sacred sources. Moreover, there was the influence of the lofty mountains enclosing this little world like rigid guardians, of the dark and gloomy woods filled at night with voices, of the wind which rushed down the valleys and howled at the windows. Never had Peter known nights so dark, or the moon with such an appearance of watching and prying. Well, there was only one cure for him: to return to the cheerful world, to hospitable rooms and happy laughter. How long indeed was it since he had laughed heartily? He went out of the ghostly church, and looked about him round the graveyard, noticing in distant corners pieces of rotten wood from the coffins, and fragments of bone, green with moss. He caught sight of Anderl bending over a newly made grave. At the sound of Peter's feet in the long grass, the lad started. "It's I, Anderl," he said sympathetically. "You mustn't stay sitting at your father's grave, lad. There's no good in that." The young, chubby-faced Anderl had become pale and thin, and his eyes gazed unsteadily. "I have to keep watch," he whispered, looking round timidly, "that the evil one may not get at him." "Your father has long ago entered into eternal happiness, and needs no one to keep watch over him," said Peter reprovingly. "Father Archangelus said so too." "It isn't sure." The beads of the rosary ran once more through the boy's thin fingers, and his lips whispered. "Aren't you going out hunting any more with Federspiel?" asked Peter. Anderl nodded. "When he goes after the fire spirits, I must go with him then." Peter was startled. How did the lad know so much? He questioned him, somewhat less friendly in his manner. The young fellow smiled disconcertedly. "You were once talking to Seraphine when I was on the bench behind the oven. Seraphine had forgotten about me. It was then I heard that you and he mean to go after the fire spirits when the time comes, and I made up my mind I'd go with you." "But you heard nothing of the kind," Peter tried to deceive him. "You dreamed all that." Anderl only shook his head slightly, and began to repeat aloud a paternoster. So this boy too knew of their design. Most likely others knew of it too. The end of section 51. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 52 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 52. On the forenoon of the next day, Peter received an unexpected visit. A pair of rough-looking peasants whom he did not know entered Zeitlenhof without ceremony in the company of Hornhaus, and dragged the mighty death-organ, the large muskets and other weapons, back to the cellar. When they had completed their work, they called bluntly for wine and food, tramped upstairs without asking leave, and made themselves at home in the study. Peter tried to conceal his annoyance, although the smell of their rank tobacco and their spitting almost made him sick. When he reproached one of them for spitting, the fellow grinned and said, "My good friend, you'll gain nothing by giving yourself airs. We peasants aren't quite as stupid as we used to be. There's one of us now in the Emperor's castle, and the town gentry have to do what he pleases. This little house of yours isn't any finer than that. But you needn't be frightened. We aren't robbers. For the matter of that, the wine in your cellar was grown by a peasant, and it was a peasant bred the pig that the side of bacon in your chimney came from. You may as well be polite to the people who have to feed you." The men turned out to be harmless enough. When one made allowance for their irritating talk, they ate and drank in moderation, and soon took themselves off. "Peasant folk want for once to be treated with consideration," said Hornhaus as they departed. Nevertheless, an uncomfortable feeling remained with Peter, and he could no longer content himself in the lonely house. The truth was that since Julia's departure the whole neighbourhood in spite of the beauty of the early autumn, appeared gloomy and repugnant to him. In his heart he knew well that it was no longer his uncle's disappearance that caused his interest in the fire-spirits, but the fact that some relation existed between them and the lovely girl. His nature was not one to profit much from the excessive simplicity of his life in this place. He had always been accustomed to lively society, and what had been tolerable to him, so long as he knew that his beloved was near, now became a joyless renunciation. The incident with the peasants, which showed an unpleasant side of their character, now increased his dissatisfaction. Was there the least obligation upon him to remain here, idle, waiting until some chance could bring Julia back to St. Maraine? The thought that she might never come back brought a sudden terror. What if she were accustomed, or should be obliged, to spend the autumn and winter in the capital? Only a quick decision could save him from the doubts which had settled on him like a flock of gloomy birds. He must follow her before perhaps she had left the little town and it had become impossible to find her again. This was no occasion for deliberation. His whole heart bade him go. Without further delay, then, he wrote a note to the hunter, promising a speedy return, packed a small valise with necessaries, charged Herlander, who was somewhat taken aback, to look after the house, gave Andurl his baggage to carry, and set off at once down to the valley, as if afraid lest something should happen to detain him. Julia! His heart sang as he descended the path so quickly that Andurl found it hard to keep up with him. Silvery threads floated towards him on the breeze from the valley, gossamers hovering in the pale sunlight and catching in his hair. The wayside bushes were loaded with long-shaped berries, and in a clump of larches sat hundreds of brightly coloured feathery balls, birds of passage, assembling for their long journey. Ah, how sweet it was once again to escape from solitude and constraint, and to descend into the broad valley striped with crops, through which the white road led out into a gladder world. He passed the scene of the battle, repressing in himself the awful memory of the bloody night of the Pontlats. There, beneath the earth, lay one another, struck down by a ball from his uncle's musket, which he had carried into the fight. No, he would not think of the Bavarian officer. It was better as it was. "I live," he said aloud, and the lad trotting beside him looked at him in surprise. He was about to enter the diligence when he was surrounded by a wild crowd of poor and wretched people, a hollow-eyed man in tatters with a matted beard, a woman in rags holding her sick infant to her skinny hanging breast, and 4 or 5 half-naked children who shouted together and thrust one another aside as they pressed forward. Filthy hands were stretched out to him. "Bread, gentlemen, bread. We are Swiss folks," the man stammered, pointing to his hollow chest. "Used to be a big man. All's over now, burnt out. Give me something for the love of God and the Holy Virgin." He gave them any loose money he had in his pocket. The peasants in the market-place looked on indifferently. They were used to such sights. Ruined people were ranging the country in bands, stealing where they could, goaded by starvation. A cool wind swept the streets of Innsbruck. Inhospitable, taciturn, cowering in fear lay the town by the foaming inn. The shops were for the most part closed, and the windows shut. Men slunk past one another. These were evil days, and every morning brought some alarming news. No one knew what lay in store. Certainly nothing good. It was easy to find a lodging. The inns were empty, and Peter was able to choose his room at the Golden Eagle. The place was full indeed of noisy and bragging militiamen, and others who gave out that they were so. Men with desperate faces, which certainly were not Tyrolese, and dialects which were not of this country. Timid and dejected, a few citizens sat about in the corners, talking with one another in a whisper. The innkeeper did not appear to recognize him, and this was a serious blow to Peter, who had hoped, by the help of this man, who had been so friendly to him before, to find out where Julia lived. As it was, he himself knew nothing of her but her Christian name. He reminded the innkeeper of the evening on which the Bavarian officers were drinking in the special room, and the beautiful young lady had come into the tap-room looking for the wild, shaggy peasant. His host looked at him sideways, put his hand to his cap with an annoyed expression, and muttered that there had been Bavarians every evening, and more peasants than they wanted. Peter mentioned that on the evening in question he had just come from Vienna, but the man only glanced at him suspiciously, saying that a great deal came from Vienna, and that it wasn't always good that came, and so left him standing there. The barmaid was equally disobliging.
"There's a lot of people come to this place," she said shortly.
He went out of the gloomy inn depressed, and passed along the arcade, losing himself at length in a short narrow lane. On an ancient stepping-stone at a corner, used by horsemen to help them in mounting, sat a wretched old woman who reached out her brown wrinkled hand. Her forlorn appearance excited pity, and he put 2 silver pieces in her withered palm.
"You are real good, sir, but don't stay in this town," she whispered in her gratitude. "It's all up, and the day of vengeance is coming."
Although the poor head underneath the large mushroom-shaped cap appeared to be crazy, he began to talk to the old woman, asking why he ought not to stay. She gazed at him with a bright look of attention.
"The peasants know it well. There are many in this town who want the Bavarians back, and they've more than once threatened to turn out the gentry. And there ain't no government. How could a little innkeeper from the Fair Valley know how to govern when kings and emperors have to learn it from childhood up? And even so, they haven't made a good hand of it."
In the midst of this important deliverance of the old woman, it occurred to him that she, sitting there begging the livelong day, might possibly know something about the beautiful, dark-haired young lady. He tried to describe as well as he could the person he was looking for, the old woman listening and wagging her head.
That's the kind of gentleman it is," she said with a titter,
the joy of a procuress lighting up in her eyes.
"I think it's in the 2nd or 3rd house in the Fuggergasse. Someone lives like what you say, sir, with a white face and black hair. There's a confectioner's at the place, and you can ask there."
She told him the way to take, smacking with her toothless jaws as if she had a piece of sugar-stick in her wrinkled mouth, and nodded after him with her trembling head. The end of section 52. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 53 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 53. He hurried off and came out into the wide main street. A couple of horsemen, sturdy fellows, were trotting haughtily down the street, their swords rattling by their sides. "The Sand Innkeeper's dragoons!" cried a young locksmith wearing a leather apron, and he gave a shrill whistle on 2 fingers. "Look out, Jacquel, your nag has dropped something." One of the men pulled up his horse with a sharp tug at the reins, and turned to ride after the youth, who ran off, his boots clattering on the pavement. At length Peter found the Fuggergasse. He passed tradesmen's signboards, little shops exhibiting dusty wares, and the dark openings of house doors. A glass door beside a semicircular window, in which were sweetmeats with flies crawling all over them, brought him to a sudden stand. He entered, announced by a bell in the door. A comfortable-looking man in a white apron, a round linen cap on his head, emerged from the back of the shop. "What can I do for you, sir?" he asked amiably. Peter, not without some embarrassment, began a description of the object of his search. He had a particularly important message for the lady, and asked if the confectioner knew where she lived, adding that he had been directed to enquire here. "You have come to the right place, I think," the man answered pleasantly. "I dare say it's Fraulein Julia you mean, or should I say Mademoiselle Avoray. She lives just here, on the 2nd floor." She often goes up to the Oberland, and people come to her from there. It might be she from your description. Would you like to give me the letter or leave a message, sir?" Peter, rejoicing in the depths of his soul, replied that he would like to deliver the message himself. "Ah, yes," exclaimed the baker, with a sly smile. "Well, sir, go straight up to the second floor. You'll easily find her. Perhaps I can oblige you with a cordial." Peter asked for a glass of ginger cordial, by way of showing his gratitude, and sipped it. "What's going to happen to us Tyrolese?" the man asked. "A gentleman like you will know more than we do." "There will soon be peace, I hope," answered Peter, absent-mindedly. "You said the very next door." He paid and went out. His friend in the white apron accompanied him obsequiously to the street, and showed him the entrance to the house. "Bad times, these," he sighed, still anxious to talk. "The peasants aren't the worst. It's the people over there beyond the inn. They'll be here to fill their sacks with loot as soon as they hear the sound of shooting. They cleared everything out of my place before. Bread, confectionery, and 100 gulden too. And I had to look on at the rascals." Peter ascended the narrow winding staircase, his hand on the leather rope hung in iron rings. It was almost dark on the landing of the second floor, but here, too, chance came to his aid. Behind one of the 3 doors opening onto the landing, he heard Julia speaking. A man's voice answered her in pleasing tones. Peter felt a sudden pain. He stood listening, his heart throbbing violently. The voices were animated. She was speaking in a foreign language. Peter tried in vain to distinguish words. The subject of their talk appeared to be painful. He waited irresolutely. Fraulein Avorai, a curious name. In this strange situation he found himself endeavouring to think of any name with a similar sound. All at once, however, he was seized by an impulse to put an end to the indignity of waiting outside her door, listening to her talking with a man. He knocked, more loudly perhaps than he had intended. The talking ceased at once. A quick step came to the door, which was opened. Bright daylight streamed out into the landing. In the midst of the brightness stood Julia, almost unearthly in her beauty, dressed in a flowing white robe caught in under her bosom by a gleaming girdle, little black velvet shoes, tied with ribbons on her feet. At one look he took in the blessed, long-desired vision. "You!" she cried, and her cheeks were suffused with a soft rosy flush of surprise. Behind her a man was standing, slim, dark-complexioned, with fine features, and in a somewhat foreign dress, a tall felt hat in his hand. "Pardon," said Peter, much taken aback. "I see that I am interrupting." His voice trembled with pain and jealousy. She looked at his open face, which was quite incapable of concealing his excited feelings, and again coloured. Without answering Peter, she whispered some rapid, unintelligible words to the stranger, who surveyed Peter Stork with a slightly inquisitive smile, and then reached out his hand. The man bowed ceremoniously to the girl, and kissed her fingers. He made a short bow to Peter, who angrily ignored it, looked at him again in polite surprise, and went out onto the landing. Julia closed the door behind him, and was alone with Peter. "We can't stand here," she said, and her voice, too, betrayed some agitation. "Come in here." She opened the door of an inner room. Peter drew a deep breath and looked round him. The apartment was very simply furnished with rep-covered chairs and a couch. A few plaster-cast groups in bas-relief hung on the walls, which were striped in blue and white. He stammered senseless excuses as she fixed her accusing eyes upon him, and hardly dared to seat himself. However, the thought of the stranger lent him the courage of disillusion. "You are angry with me," he said. "Despise me, perhaps, for my importunity, but there are things stronger than promises and resolves. I could not endure to remain longer without you. Well, I have had my punishment now." His voice faltered. "What punishment?" she asked, her eyes opening wide. "Julia!" His eyes flamed. "Was that not a foreigner who left you just now?" "Since you already know," she said haughtily, "And you would betray this wretched country to its enemies?" he cried. "Julia, you—" His hat fell from his hand and rolled on the floor. "I would rather a bullet had gone through my heart that day when you waved to me as we were leaving Saint Maraine." She made a hurried gesture of contradiction.
"I am betraying no one," she said sadly.
"But this meeting, Julia, the country, this poor little peasant country, is preparing for a last struggle with an enemy that is more than its match." The girl looked at him long and gravely.
"This man took a great risk in coming into this country in order to bring me news of my mother's death, and he advised me to leave Tyrol before the Dalmatian regiments come over the passes."
"So your mother—" Peter could think of nothing to say. He clenched his hands helplessly.
"You need not try to console me," she said coldly. "I am not grieving for the woman who gave me life. She was a worthless woman,
She bit her lips. "But what is he to you, this foreigner?" he cried suddenly. "Julia, I cannot bear it." She moved close to him and laid her hand lightly on his arm.
"He brought me the news," she said. "I never saw him before in my life. He is from the place I used to live in, that's all. You need not torture yourself."
Unable to speak, he bent over her hand and kissed it. She drew him up to her. A flame shone in both their eyes. With a passionate movement she threw her arms round his neck, and their lips met in a long kiss. Her hair touched his cheeks.
"Oh, sunt tien,"
she whispered, as she had done once before, and his blood caught fire. "No!" She wept, implored, pressed herself to him, kissed him again and again.
"It was I who was at your bedside on that night, dearest. I kissed you as you lay asleep."
Her eyes grew large and soft. Her supple body quivered in his embrace. She gave herself, weary of resistance. A cry of woe caused the man to tremble in the midst of the storm of the senses. He wakened up, bewildered, like one who has been startled out of a deep dream. The peal of the noontide bells sounded in the room, which was filled with garish light. He shuddered. A memory rose up out of the mists of the past, and with a sudden apprehension he looked towards the door, as though it were opened a little, as though he saw, through the narrow chink, a woman's face distorted with pain. "Mother," he groaned, looking wildly round him. He glanced at Julia, who was gazing at him with dark, dead eyes, filled with a nameless horror. "Oh, God," he murmured, "what has happened? Forgive, forgive!" He extended his hands imploringly to Julia. She rose, put her hands in her disordered hair, and gazed fixedly in front of her.
"I am lost," she murmured.
"I am lost." Large, burning tears ran down her cheeks. "Julia!" he cried. "Speak to me. Do speak." A sad smile passed over her face.
"Go," she said. "Leave me."
He rose obediently and took up his hat. "When shall I see you again?" he asked. "When, Julia?"
"Never, never."
Her voice was now quite steady.
"Go, go if you love me."
The end of Section 53. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 54 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson. Translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 54. He went, stumbling down the steep spiral stairway, paused in the narrow street, then walked away as if in a dream. Sun-midden! Whence came this fear which seemed to be settling upon him amid these crowds of indifferent people hurrying to their midday meal from workshop and office? So on that night it had been she. The silky black hair discovered by Notberger had been hers. In the pale moonlight streaming through the window at Seitenhof, her lips had touched his mouth, wakening him, and at a time when he had scarcely dared to hope, and was devoured by longing. It was his destiny to cast a stain on everything pure that came near him. A curse lay upon him, ever since that terrible hour in which his mother had looked at him through the half-open door, and now a new load of guilt oppressed him. From the door of the inn an odour of grease and onions reached him. Why had he returned? For food? He laughed crazily to himself and walked along the arcades, at length finding himself in front of the yellow pile of the castle, at the gate of which 2 men with muskets were on guard. As he looked up at one of the large windows, he caught sight of a thick-set man with close-cropped hair and full beard, his hands in his leather belt. No doubt the sand innkeeper. The ruddy, good-natured countenance of the Tyrolese commander-in-chief appeared grave and anxious. Involuntarily Peter raised his hat, and Andreas Hofer nodded twice in a friendly manner before turning round and disappearing into the apartment, from which issued a lively air, sung by several voices. Peter wandered along by the roaring inn, and gradually the fit of penitence left him. Thoughts of his happiness came to him, wrapping him as if in a royal robe of silk and gold. "She is mine," he said to himself. "Everything else is nothing." People looked at him as they passed. A besotted-looking old fellow, blinking craftily, came up to him, and trudging beside him, tried to engage him in conversation. Peter tossed a gratuity into the greasy hat which the man held in his hands as he walked, and realized from the overwhelming gratitude of the recipient that he had given a gold piece. He smiled, his heart blossoming like a rose, but a voice whispered out of the depths of his memory, the childish voice of little Sylvana. "There's a saying with those who have knowledge, when the purity of the Sun-Maiden is stained, God dies." In sudden anguish he ran back, losing himself several times in the narrow passages of the old part of the town, and stopped to recover his breath in front of Julie's house. But as he was about to enter the house door, the confectioner, who had been observing him through his own window, came, redolent of vanilla, out of the shop, and called, "She's not there now." "The lady?" said Peter, almost staggering. "She has left. A peasant fetched her away in a basket carriage." "Left?" Peter gazed blankly at the man's knowing smile. "A foreigner?" he cried, his voice choking with anger. The other shook his head slowly. "Oh, no, he wasn't a foreigner. I don't think you need to be jealous, sir," he added, smiling. "He was a black, hairy fellow from the mountains, and he has often been here before with the lady." He ran quickly into the shop and returned with a flask and a glass. "This came from the monastery, particularly good for a sudden upset." Peter drank the acrid aromatic spirits and leaned against the wall of the house. He was in the depths. "I know what it's like," said the confectioner confidentially. "I had my share in my own young days. If I may be so bold, I should tell you, sir, that before I settled down here I travelled to Hungary as far as Temeswar, and on the other side to Stuttgart in Swabia. And for a young journeyman trading in sweet things such as the women like, there are pretty girls enough. And trouble, too, now and then. But that passes. Time goes by." Peter escaped from the man's good-natured chatter and paced along the narrow street. There was only one thing to do: return at once. Fentor the smith had taken her away. He inquired for the post-house. After some trouble he discovered the postmaster in the inn near the triumphal gate, deep in a game of cards, amid clouds of tobacco smoke. "Eh? A special chaise to the upper Inn-Valley? Did the gentleman know what that would cost? In such times as these, and it's so scarce. And when troops were on the road joining up with Speckbacher and Haspinger in order to march on Salzburg. And what sort of money would the fare be paid in? No one would take Hoffer's 20-florin pieces or Vienna banknotes. Bavarian coins were also doubtful. Sometimes one was up, sometimes the other." Peter took gold from his pocket. "Ah," said the old gentleman politely, "that's another matter. I'll book you." He entered Peter's name and asked where he came from. "Vienna. Compliments. You must then have heard what happened at the armistice of Znaim. They say the Emperor had to promise to give us no more help in Tyrol." A troubled look came into the postmaster's tired eyes. "If only we could have known that earlier." "Unfortunately, I know nothing of these matters," Peter answered. He wished only to be alone, to feel that every pace of the horses was bringing him nearer to the only being for whom his heart yearned. "Ah, you didn't hear. The Emperor has other countries to think about. I suppose if a few peasants and students lie under the sod, they won't allow it to spoil their appetites in Schönbrunn. The devil himself will come for the rest of us now. Are prospects really so bad?" Peter was touched by the old man's bitter hopelessness. "There's no enemy now in the country." The postmaster took a pinch from his tortoise-shell snuff-box. "I dare say, but we hear from the postboys how things are looking. There's dirty weather brewing, they say. Bavarians and Frenchmen thicker than flies in summer. Yes, it's just as I always said it would be. We should have made up with the Bavarians and spared ourselves the French." Peter thought of Flederer's letter, of Federspiel. This was precisely what they had said. "The chaise will be ready at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning," said the old man as they parted. Tomorrow morning. Peter went back along the Maria Theresienstrasse in despair. At St. Anna's Column there was an excited crowd. An armed band had collected, chiefly lads, with a few men, some quite old. A bottle of wine was being passed round, and loaves of bread. A carelessly handled musket went off with a crack, and the bullet went whistling over the roofs. "Oh, you blockhead!" shouted a laughing voice. A youth of 16 stood pale with fright, the smoking weapon in his hands. A bent, white-haired old man near Peter, wearing a bright red shooting jacket, looked at him with clear, vulture eyes. "I'm no use, mister. My bones ache too badly." "You'll have to come," interjected a man who wore a gold-tasselled hat in which were 2 cock's feathers. "Haven't you a St. Luke's letter in your bag? And you can shoot like you never lose a bullet." Aye, muttered the old man, "but the way it catches me. I've seen him myself picking the bullets out of his coat. He's made of ice. Lead can't touch him. Hey, gentlemen, you'll come too?" He uttered a hoarse laugh. Peter went on. He heard a whistle behind him, a laugh, and a word which he did not understand. In the dim light of the tap-room in the Golden Eagle, he listened to the ceaseless tale of the troubles and anxieties which now weighed on the Tyrolese. God, would it never come to an end, this murdering? The people were exhausted, empty of all hope, and each day the suffering grew worse. The young men had grown wild and thrown off all restraint. The food prices were intolerable. Roaming bands had begun to rob again. The moving stories of how the Emperor had wept, and of how the Archduke Johann had implored to be allowed to put himself at the head of the Tyrolese, were no longer circulated. And the worst news was that in the south 20,000 men had decamped at the approach of the French General Péry, with 4,000 men. The wonder was that he delayed his advance so long. It was also reported that the King of Bavaria had wished to come to terms with the Tyrolese, but that Napoleon would not allow it. The people of Vienna had sent Hofer a golden chain of honour and several thousand ducats. What had become of the gold? Who had seen anything of the yellow boys? The sand innkeeper, perhaps. Hofer was a secret fellow, someone said venomously, but the others were indignant and forbade him to speak thus of their leader, who was an upright man. The slanderer slipped out of the room. "Bavarian rascal!" they shouted after him, but in their anger there was an undertone of depression. Yes, everyone now spoke as Federspiel had spoken from the first. The end of section 54. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 55 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 55. After a sleepless night, Peter set forth on his journey. The chaise drove along by the foaming river in beautiful September weather. White clouds sailed before the east wind over the blue sky towards the Oberland. Every now and then the postilion blew on his horn a note half merry and half melancholy. He was a pleasant fellow, rarely using the whip. Peter was sunk in gloomy thoughts, and what he saw did not tend to improve his spirits. Several times the little vehicle, as it rolled easily along, was met by small companies of musketeers, who gazed at him with the grave look of men forewarned of death, yet passed the pleasant greeting of the country folk. Once Peter drove through a crowd of fighting men, resting by the wayside. One or two detached themselves from the others and limped after the vehicle with threatening shouts. At a village in which he spent the night he met with an adventure, at first somewhat disturbing. Peasants with dark looks were crowding round the table at which he sat. The fact that he was from Vienna and was travelling to St. Marain by no means satisfied them. "Who is this fellow?" inquired someone in a sharp authoritative voice, and a well-dressed gentleman thrust the peasants aside and came forward to the table. "For this expression, sir, if you are a man of honour, you will not refuse me satisfaction," said Peter, firing up. The stranger bowed. "I am Count Hedel, at your service," he said. "That is, as soon as I feel assured that I have to do with an honest man, not before." But Peter found an unexpected ally.
"Sir, weren't you with us at Pontlat's bridge, when a friend of mine had to give up the ghost?"
He described Anderl's father. "I was standing beside him," answered Peter. The peasant looked at the Count, who stepped forward at once to Peter and cried, "I must ask you most earnestly, sir, to excuse me, if you will permit me. I shall be very glad to join you at your table." "These swells won't do anything to one another," muttered a man in the background. "They hold together always." "That wouldn't help them much," said the man who had recognized Peter. "The gentleman picked the Bavarian officer off his horse so cleanly that I nearly died laughing. There's nothing to say against that." The peasants withdrew into a corner, and the same speaker told further stories of the fight at Pontlat's. "Years ago I was a student myself," the Count laughed, "and I was delighted at the way you jumped when you heard the word fellow." In spite of all his trouble, Peter could not help smiling. "I am very anxious," said the Count. "It's now or never with us, Herr... What did you say? Herr Stork? Von Stork? No, Herr Stork, then." He whispered across the table. "The Tyrolese can do no more. No wonder, when one thinks of what the poor folk have been through. And yet there's nothing else for it. Even though they no longer pay any attention to Speckbacher's letters and call Haspinger a rogue of a priest, they must fight. And now the devil is coming, Napoleon himself." "They were very despondent at Innsbruck," observed Peter. "I can believe it." The Count's face worked. "I am very anxious myself. And Vienna, I knew Archduke Karl well, the hero of German nationality, and I left Vienna because it horrified me to see how the services of that nobleman went for nothing. He's too much of a popular hero, you understand. And Andreas Hofer, he too will presently be thought too popular yonder, and though it should cost only a word to save him, that word, Herr Stork, will not be spoken." Who was it that had once used these very words? Was it Federspiel again? He appeared to possess the uncanny gift of knowing everything sooner than others. "You speak very candidly," said Peter, with a glance at the attentive peasants. "My feelings get the better of me," returned the Count. "It isn't always a good thing to put such thoughts into words. For all that, Herr Stork, I ask you not to think less of me for it. It may very well be that I shall soon have to take the long journey, and I should be sorry if you should then think ill of me." Peter grasped the hand of this strange man. "We will hope for better things. After all, I may die in my bed. Who knows?" The peasants' leader laughed. "Bonne nuit, monsieur," and he left the room, his spurs clanking. Though very tired, Peter lay awake for a long time beneath his huge quilt. 2 tearful eyes, filled with a nameless despair, were fixed upon him. "Never, never," a weeping voice said, and as memory began to fade at the approach of sleep, the pale countenance changed, and he thought he was standing in his study at Zeitunghof, listening to a sad song which the forsaken girl, the other, had been used to sing. When, towards noon on the following day, he had reached the top of the narrow road and caught sight of the roofs of St. Marain, he felt as if, after a long absence and many adventures, he were returning home. The place now so intimately known to him, and which so suddenly had grown hateful and intolerable, once more soothed and restored him. Yonder in their places were all the familiar peaks, with rounded or broken outlines, the Hockauf, the Shellbock, the Black Lien, and the Haberer, and beyond these the shining white summits of the Erzos and the Wild Man. His heart beat fast when he saw the smith's dark face looking out of the door of the house in which he supposed was his beloved. He glanced cautiously up at the window, but there was no sign of her. In the rows where swarms of flies, weak and languid in the late season, were buzzing about the empty glass and rings of moisture on the table, Christian Legatfora lay on the bench asleep. His breath came heavily, and his swollen face was tinged with blue. The drunken man's hand moved helplessly in the direction of the flies, as they crawled over his perspiring skin. Peter stood for a while at the open window, peering out at the smith's house, and coughed loudly once or twice, but the innkeeper would not be roused, and no little hand was raised to the bolt of the window over yonder. He went on through the village with a heavy heart. No one was to be seen. The street was empty, no living thing but a tabby cat crossing the road with velvet feet and mewing softly. The trees were fading, and golden leaves fluttered down from a birch. The woods were tinged with a soft red, and jays screamed in the mountain ash trees. The summer was over. Beside the door of Zeitlinghof the painted skeleton figure leered at him with hollow eyes, holding the fife to its thin lips. No note was heard, but Peter knew that this sinister figure was practising a horrible tune which would soon shrill forth. He stepped slowly across the threshold. The end of section 55. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 56 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 56. He heard a clash of pots and crockery, and Herlander ran out. Thank God the master was back again. All sorts of vagrant people had been coming up from the valley, demanding food and drink, and casting thievish glances at everything. Strangers mostly, from heaven knows where, foreigners and gypsies. Dinner would soon be ready. Yes, and Herr Federspiel had come every day to know when the master would be back. He had something important to say. After a hasty meal, Peter went off at once. Seraphim Federspiel looked ailing and suffering, and the churchyard roses on his cheeks were brighter than ever. As usual, his pipe hung in his mouth, making him cough still more. He sprang up in joyful surprise as Peter entered. "That's right, I'm glad. I was giving you up. You haven't then altogether forgotten what day tomorrow is?" Peter looked at him in surprise. "Tomorrow? The equinox. The time for the fire spirits. I had begun to fear you were leaving me in the lurch. Well, now you are here. We'll go through with it, Herr Stork." Impatiently as Peter had often thought of the long interval before the autumnal equinox, when the fire spirits made their second appearance in the year, Federspiel's words now awakened little response in him. True, the fiery people would then descend into the clam, as they had done in spring, and perhaps he would succeed in getting a little certain knowledge about them. But what, after all, did it matter to him? It would not bring his uncle back. His thoughts, which kept circling in feverish longing round the smith's house, entered only reluctantly into Federspiel's plans, which had lately been his own as well. "The equinox. Ah, yes," he said abstractedly, and idly took up a bullet mould lying on the table. Was it that he had expected to hear some news of his beloved from the hunter? Federspiel looked at him disapprovingly. "It seems to me that you have lost most of your interest in what has already cost us so much trouble and danger. When the end is in sight, then you mean to stand out of it?" A furrow of displeasure appeared on his forehead, and almost angrily he took the iron implement out of Peter's hand. "Speak plainly, Herr Stork. If you want to leave me in the lurch, very well. But speak out what is in your mind. I can go on with the affair by myself, I suppose." "I am going with you," said Peter. It was as though someone else was speaking with his voice. "You aren't very enthusiastic," said the hunter ironically. "You can't be when you have something else on your mind." "It's the journey," said Peter, by way of excuse. He was hurt by the other's ill humour. "Of course I'm going with you." "What's the matter with you, then?" asked Federspiel, looking at him searchingly. "You have lines about your mouth all at once. The journey knocked you up, eh?" "A little," said Peter, meeting his eyes. "When do we start?" The sick man's face brightened up. "Ah, you feel battered after your expedition. I was a little unsympathetic, I suppose," he said more gently. "Well, it's all right now that you're coming. I shouldn't have cared to have to do it alone. Listen, then." He lit his pipe again, puffing and coughing, and glanced quickly at the window, then took a stride to the door, which he flung open. "You must know, I'm being watched," he muttered. "The fire spirits are on their guard. Sylvana came to the window yesterday evening and begged and besought me to let her sleep here. The young rascal. She had been sent, so I said you and I would have to pay an early visit to the valley. They will certainly be on the lookout for us, and there's nothing for it but to go down a bit of the way and then come back by the stream. We'll hide ourselves up there through the day till they come, and if they don't come, it's their day, and they will come, as they have done always. And then we'll follow them in there. I'll call for you as soon as it's daylight, Herr Stork." One of his terrible coughing fits seized him. "I have shot a good many innocent creatures," he groaned at last. "I hid myself now." As Peter left the cottage, Andel started out from behind a bush. "May I go with you tomorrow?" he asked at once. His eyes shone. "Tomorrow? Where?" asked Peter. "To the fire spirits." Peter forced a laugh. "What do you mean, Andel? Federspiel and I are going to Prutz in the morning." The boy looked at him and put out his underlip. "So I'm not going with you?" he asked defiantly. "Be off with you," ordered Peter. "You are crazy with your fire spirits." Andel looked at him sullenly, and was about to say something, but turned abruptly and went off towards the village. Peter determined to make one more attempt to catch sight of Julia, but as he approached the inn, a terrible sound of lamentation reached his ears. There was a crowd of people round the door. In the midst of them stood the innkeeper's young cousin, wringing her hands and uttering shrill cries, her eyes wide in horror. Peter hurried forward anxiously and tried to enter the house, but Hornhaus, who was in the crowd, caught his arm. "Don't go in," he said warningly. "You wouldn't like it. He's blue all over, and the eyes are standing out of his head. I must send a message at once to Engadine, to Notberger, though I don't know the place where she lives." "Hanged himself?" cried Peter. "Dead as a mouse," continued the other. "Just as old Blasi said. We cut the rope at once, but his soul had gone out of him. And there was a note lying on the table. I have it here." He handed a bit of paper to Peter. "The drummer is taking me away," were the words written in a clumsy, shaky hand. "Where is he?" faltered Peter, with tears in his eyes. "In the shed,
at the back of the house. He left the note in the room."
Peter fled away in horror to his house. In the study he found quietness. The evening had drawn on, and the stars were sparkling. He was bound in honour to join the adventure of the morrow, though convinced beforehand of failure. It was indeed possible that by the light of pine torches smugglers' goods were dragged into the sepulchral chamber, and it might easily be that these had previously been stored in other similar hiding places. The fact that the face of the shellbok was unscalable was no argument to the contrary. The goods might have been brought into the caves by other paths, and might be fetched thence by the smugglers. It was all so unimportant. Even poor Christiane's death, dreadful as had been the first horror of it, was fading from his mind. All his thoughts were directed to a different subject. In Vienna were small white country houses, in the midst of shrubs and lawns, with roses and jessamines clambering over them. Happy people lived there, a cheerful race of men and women, catching the moments as they passed, good-natured, and with an understanding of love affairs. Some little nook could surely be found there for himself and Julia. To her he felt that he was united for ever. This gloomy house, with its skeleton fifer, might meanwhile fall to pieces, crumbling away in snow, rain, and storm. Was it not madness to commit his young life to it? He repented deeply that he had given his promise to the hunter. He had thus lost a valuable day, a day, perhaps, spent by the lovely girl in bitter grief. Was it not his most sacred duty, despite her never, to force his way to her, to dry her tears, and to devote himself to her for ever? And could he live and again be happy, without knowing that she was to be his always? He went to the balcony and looked out. The stars shone clear, but night here was less the friend of man than elsewhere. The distant, angry roar of the torrent, the blasts of wind in the black tree-tops, had a threatening and hostile sound. Depression and melancholy were the lot of those who dwelt here. Trees fell and crushed people. Storm clouds brandished a blinding and fatal sword of flame. Avalanches of earth and stone slew and maimed. Snow and ice lulled wayfarers into their last sleep. The soil was hard and niggardly, the summer brief. And yet it was for this poor country that these people were fighting. It was their mother, whom they loved all the more for her poverty. They asked nothing of the great world, wished only to be let live in peace, and that no one should meddle with their fixed and pious faith. They were heroes, fighting not for gain and dying great in their simplicity. He undressed in the dark and went to bed. For a long time his thoughts kept circling round the house of his gloomy enemy, Fentor. The end of section 56. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 57 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 57. In the grey dawn he was startled out of sleep. A pebble had been flung at his window, and a low whistle announced that Federspiel was ready. He washed and dressed, drank a little cold milk, and stole out of the house. Cocks were crowing, and the ravens flew above the fir trees. Federspiel was waiting below. Peter's account of his meeting with Anderl appeared to annoy him. "I don't like the lad," he said. "He's always with that capuchin fox, watching me. If only now he doesn't run after us." Talking loudly, like folk who have business in hand, they took the road down to the valley. They had gone only a little way when the hunter made a sudden movement, stumbling as he strode forwards. He uttered a low curse and kicked a stone out of his way. Peter looked at him inquiringly, but the other gave a warning glance and began to talk vivaciously of a hank of red wool which he would have to buy at the dealer's. At the same time he took from his pocket a small round mirror and held it in the hollow of his hand. They walked on until they had turned a bend of the road. Then he stood still, breathing deeply.
"He has climbed down now," he whispered, "and he's going back to the village. I saw it all in the glass."
"Who?"
"Old Blasi was hiding very cleverly in the top of the bent fir when we were passing. I was startled when I caught sight of him, and pretended I tripped over a stone. They are good watchers, those chaps."
He looked round carefully in every direction, examining through his glass for a long time the mountain slopes. Then they descended into the bed of the stream, and were soon under cover of the strip of wood which followed it. The roar was deafening. The water seethed and bubbled. The great mill was in action, pounding together gravel, broken wood, and fragments of rock. Trout sprang at glancing flies. Bushes trailed low branches in the cascades. Then they had to jump from stone to stone, and after much toil they reached that point in the clam at which the path began to descend. Here they stayed for a long time under cover and kept a lookout. There was no sign of anything unusual. The fire spirits were no doubt still sleeping. Federspiel drew Peter cautiously towards him to a spot where thick bushes offered a good hiding place. The entire path through the walls of the clam could be seen from this point, and a patch of dry grass afforded both concealment and rest.
"Go to sleep for a little, Herr Stork," the hunter invited him. "I'll keep guard."
Peter still felt in his eyes the traces of last night's wakefulness, and yielded. Federspiel made a bed of the dry grass with his knapsack, covered by a handkerchief for a pillow. It made a comfortable bed, and the noise of the water quickly lulled Peter to sleep. He started up, not knowing where he was, but was reassured when he saw his companion still seated on the same block of stone. The whole place, however, looked different. It was dark now at the bottom of the clam, and the edge of the cliff above, which had reflected the rays of the sun with dazzling brightness, lay now within a broad band of shadow. Even the path looked dim and grey. Federspiel offered him bacon and bread.
"I call that a good sleep," said he. "It's well on in the afternoon now, but that's nothing. We have time enough, and you wanted a sleep."
"I had bad dreams about Christian," said Peter.
"You knew what the end must be. Handel was with me. The lad's gone to pieces. Stop!"
he cried suddenly, and putting the field-glass to his eye, he gazed for some time down the clam.
"Now I would have sworn I saw a head down there in the bushes."
He looked again.
"I suppose it must have been a bird."
"I wonder whether my uncle watched like this," mused Peter.
"I dare say he did. Who can tell? Perhaps he's lying somewhere about in the bushes. When I die I could wish for nothing better than that they would let my corpse lie in some spot in the wood, with air, earth, and water round it, so that it might be transformed into new life, blue flies and green grass, a litter of young foxes and little ravens, a feast for roots and beetles. I would lose myself in everything, as I have wanted to all my life long. However, they'll put me into some dark hole and shovel earth over me."
He shuddered with horror. "And the soul?" said Peter.
"Can't believe in that," said the hunter gloomily. "It would be a consolation to me when I have to go away from everything while still young, from the woods and mountain and game, from women whom I have had little enough of, though they are sweet as honey and silky like young hares. A sick man thinks and broods a lot, Herr Stork, so you mustn't object to my talking. You who have a long life in front of you."
He gave a little sigh of envy and was silent. They sat for a good while thus, listening to the roar of the water and watching the light fade continually. The dusk gathered, and presently Peter saw his companion's face only as a pale spot. The outlines overhead were dim. Out of the thicket where they sat, a great white owl rose with a silent beat of the wings, hovered over them, and then, close by, they heard a hideous hooting laugh, like the cry of a ghost amid the noise of the stream. Night came slowly up out of the valley. Suddenly Federspiel's fingers closed with a tight grip on Peter's arm, and with his other hand he pointed overhead. On the edge of the clam above them, just where the mountain began, a yellow flame appeared, moving downward slowly and unsteadily. A second, a third, a fourth, several others followed. The lights were plainly moving with the steps and leaps of people who carried them. The hunter's hand, still retaining its hold on Peter's arm, was trembling violently. Breathless with excitement, Peter watched the train of lights clambering down. The first had reached the bottom of the path, and came to stand about 30 paces from where they watched. He could be seen distinctly emerging from the bushes. "The devil!" cried Federspiel into Peter's ear. Peter, too, was terribly startled. It was the devil. The end of section 57. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 58 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson. Translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 58. It was the Evil One. A hairy skin covered the upper part of his body, his arms and hands. His shapeless legs tramped along the narrow path beside the stream. Above the shaggy neck appeared a horrible countenance with a satanic grimace, surmounted by pointed ears with green eyes and wreathed horns. Peter's heart stopped beating. A second devil came out, with fat, puffy cheeks, pale, brassy eyes, and white, bristling beard, buck's horns between his flaccid ears. A boar's tusks protruded from his jaws. Peter thought he must be dreaming, and gave himself a sharp pinch on the arm. "Wake up," he said to himself, shutting and opening his eyelids. What was Federspiel about? He was moving his arm and bending forward. Ah, he was looking through his little telescope. It was shifting about and finally came to rest. All at once the hunter laughed, nodded to Peter and said, "It's a masquerade. They have false faces, hairs of bark fibre, eyes of tin foil, goats' horns." The gigantic devil who had been the first to appear raised his torch and gave a long and careful look about him. His hideous face turned slowly round. "The shuffler was quite right," hissed Federspiel. "Sure enough, there are 5 devils." He laughed noiselessly. At this moment the leader of the procession took the mask from his face and stripped off the hairy hide from his body. "Fentor!" exclaimed Peter and the hunter simultaneously. Without suspecting anything, the people continued their progress, and each of them was plainly visible in the torchlight. Gravely and ceremoniously they followed one after the other, old Blasi, the charcoal burner, other peasants whom they did not know. Was Julia amongst them? The procession passed them. There were many people, but the girl was not amongst them. The last was the charcoal burner's son. Presently the two were sitting again in profound darkness. "Up!" cried Federspiel. "We must follow them. Keep close to me." Far in advance of them, the torches glimmered, points of light, vanishing into the chasm out of which issued the raging stream. A murky red light came from within the cavern. They waited for a long time, then slowly approached the entrance, which was lit up by a torch fastened in a cleft. They heard stumbling steps behind them, and turned in dismay. It was Andor, his face deadly pale. "I can't stay here by myself," he gasped. "Jesus and Mary!" Federspiel's mouth twitched, and the muscles of his jaw stood out like knots. But when he saw the horror in the boy's face, he forced himself to be calm. "If we are all done for, it's your fault," he said carelessly. "Get in behind us. If you breathe a sound, it's all up." Without turning his head again in the direction of the quaking Andor, he stepped into the passage. Peter followed close behind him. What would happen now? They reached the sepulchral chamber without encountering any hindrance. By the gleam of a torch, which here too was crackling and smoking, held by a ring in the rock, they could see into a passage which the block of stone, now lying back, left open. This was the way by which the rover had come, closing it behind him. The figures in the wall seemed to move in the ruddy light. A look of mockery played about the lips of the Roman tribune. Federspiel advanced without hesitating. They went for some time along a dark passage. The air was heavy, warm, and moist. In the dead silence which prevailed here, the slightest noise could be heard. All at once Federspiel uttered a low cry. He had come out into the open air. They were standing in a deep hollow enclosed by lofty walls of rock. High, infinitely high overhead, shone the stars of evening. A gleaming waterfall descending from the top of the cliff in front of them filled the darkness with its roar, and formed a small lake from which rose a grey mist. Large shrubs as high as trees stood in the warm moist air. Peter plucked a leaf, and a sticky moisture remained in his hand. He touched it with his tongue, and found it sweet. These were the trees which in summer bore red blossoms, foreign trees which were able to thrive in this warm atmosphere. Giovanelli's rhododendrons. "The chamois garden," said Federspiel. "We are in the chamois garden." It was sultry and vaporous like a hothouse. There were hot springs here, and the air was oppressive and stagnant. "Yonder, yonder!" The hunter pointed to a cavern behind the waterfall. They crept in behind the sparkling curtain. As they went on, the cave narrowed, and a faint light glimmered in the distance, and then they came to a stand in front of a thick, musty-smelling curtain, through a division in which the light had appeared. The hunter hesitated. "The risk must be taken," he whispered, looking back, and passed through the curtain. Peter, with Anderl holding on to his coat, followed. Then they stood still, motionless, rooted to the ground with amazement. They found themselves in a spacious rocky hall, feebly illuminated by a few small lamps. Many people were here assembled, waiting motionless in devout attention. No one turned round as they entered, and stood quietly in the deep shadow. By the light of the small, widely separated oil lamps, they could distinguish no further details. On the wall opposite the entrance there appeared to be a whitish stone platform, on which they could dimly make out human figures. In front of it rose a kind of altar, on which was something bright. Overhead the vaulted roof disappeared mysteriously in darkness. Midway, on the left of the motionless throng, could be seen the black opening of a side gallery. There was a sudden stir, and the crowd seemed to take a quick breath. Sweet and clear came the notes of a flute, simple and moving. The spring in the wood! The flute beside the spring in the wood had sounded just so. The light in the opening of the side gallery was extinguished. The flute tones grew louder. A movement passed over the assembly. "The ravens and the hidden ones," whispered a voice in front of Peter, tremulous with awe. "The Father is coming." The notes of the flute rose to a jubilant strain, and grew stronger and fuller. Peter recognized it well. It was the panpipes of the charcoal burner's son. Two small figures appeared out of the narrow side door, Sylvana and a girl of the same age, whom they did not know, naked and white, a glistening girdle round their slender loins. They danced with short, graceful steps, setting one foot before the other. Behind them came the lad with the shepherd's pipe, clothed in a speckled goatskin. His arms and legs were bare, and a strap fastened his shaggy coat in front. A garland of little white roses lay round his dark locks. He was accompanied by 3 other boys, similarly attired. "The lion," said the voice again, tremulous with reverence before the mystery. A gigantic figure entered, wearing a round iron cap on his wild hair, and over his leather jerkin a coat of ring mail, which allowed his formidable arms to be seen. He had short trousers, and sandals were strapped to his feet. In his hand flashed a drawn sword. It was Fentor, the smith. Anderl trembled so violently that, in spite of his own excitement, Peter laid his arm on the boy's shoulder to reassure him. He heard a whispered prayer, or was it a low sob?
"Be quiet, for God's sake," he breathed.
The girls with the torches, the piper, and the mighty wielder of the sword remained standing beside the entrance. A loud, swelling hymn burst from the cavern. "Nama, Nama Sebestio, Father, Father." Loud sobs and yearning cries were heard. The people extended their arms, and many sank on their knees. An aged man appeared through the side door. Peter experienced a powerful and inexplicable emotion which constrained him to fall on his knees. He felt that he must prostrate himself in the presence of this man who had entered. It was the Rover but transformed. He walked solemnly amid the torches, clad in a snow-white robe, over which hung in heavy purple folds from his shoulders a regal cloak. A golden circlet adorned his lofty brow. In his hands he bore a shining chalice, which he raised in blessing as he moved along. All bowed low, murmuring a prayer in deep devotion. Who was he? When had Peter seen this proud yet infinitely mild and kind countenance, the glorified expression of a godlike soul? Passionate love for this aged and unknown man gushed from his heart, and he knew now that in the hard and scornful face of that strange being who had twice crossed his path, a faint semblance of this transformed face had fascinated him from the first. He recognized that it was a mysterious and unacknowledged love which had been roused in him, in spite of the stranger's repellent mien. And now he saw that face redeemed from its sinister likeness to the cruel head of the Roman soldier, and transfigured. He felt a touch. It was Federspiel's hand, which sought his own, and betrayed by its fervent grip a deep devotion. What ailed the hunter? A tear glistened on his sunken cheek, but there was no possibility of questioning him. He now saw something which made him forget everything else. The end of section 58. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 59 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 59. "The Sun Maiden! Look! It is she!" A murmur went round. People rose up in a transport. Peter scarcely breathed. "Julia!" She came in, clothed like the beautiful old man in white, and like him wearing a golden circlet round her head. She held in her hands a crystal bowl in which a blue flame burned. In a moment the place was inundated with light. Through a great shining sphere of glass poured the brilliance, within wide concentric circles of 12 colours: scarlet red, violet hues, yellow dun, deep green, honey colour, sky blue, water green, milk white. The figures on the marble platform were bathed in the fiery brightness. A youth in a Phrygian cap and flying cloak knelt on a mighty bull, a short sword raised for the thrust. "Soli invicto Mithrae." These words were inscrolled above him. "Mithra," said Peter to himself. "A Mithra temple." He could hear Federspiel's heavy breathing beside him, but it all seemed like a dream, unreal and phantasmal. His drunken eyes took in only the figure of his beloved and her white face, as she paced forward bearing the bowl in which the bluish flame flickered. The old man approached her, a bundle of pine shavings in his hand. A pile of wood stood ready, and beside it shone the chalice on which lay a slice of bread. Slowly the priest extended his hand towards the sacred flame. No one breathed in the solemn stillness. Then the Sun Maiden seemed to totter. The bowl in her hands slanted over and clashed in pieces on the ground. The blue flame was extinguished. A cry of consternation, in which Peter's involuntary exclamation was drowned, went up from the whole assembly. The girl buried her lovely face in her hands and fell on her knee, and a cry of woe escaped from her. An awful silence fell. The people remained in helpless attitudes, as if unable to move. Then she sprang up and ran to the side passage. Her garment caught in the torch borne by Sylvana, which fell crackling on the ground. Her white streaming robe disappeared in the dark opening. She was no longer pure, and it was no longer permitted her to touch the vessel containing the sacred fire. In the deep silence which had followed the general cry of horror, all eyes were fixed apprehensively on the old man. The pine shavings slipped from his hand with a dry rustling sound. Slowly he turned his head. There was a profound sadness in his noble face, and with a gesture of final despair he hid his face in the sleeves of his priestly garment. A low moan came from him. He raised his head, deadly pale and with features of stone. Then, lifting his hands above him, he called out in a hollow and broken voice, "I de I escutrien, I ven, ad essa sarain, I ven freed, Deus mora." The young girls threw on the ground their torches, which were extinguished in smoke. A solitary voice was heard calling in mortal terror, "Father!" The old man appeared to be in search of something, looked round, then caught his hands to his heart as if in sudden agony, and fell. With a hoarse yell the smith sprang to the inanimate figure, and lifted it as though it were a child. The old man's arms hung loose. The bright lights were reflected in his wide-open eyes. Once more there were loud cries of lamentation. People fell prostrate on their faces. Shrieks were heard. Peter's arm was gripped. "Away! Away quick!" whispered Federspiel. "Profanation!" someone cried. Angry eyes gleamed, and hands were stretched threateningly in the direction of the intruders. A sword flashed out. "Now for our lives!" cried the hunter, pulling Peter away. They tore madly back along the passage, the lad behind them whimpering, half crazy with terror. As they raced along breathlessly, Federspiel caught a half-extinguished torch out of its ring and swung it round till it blazed again. The waterfall was lit up with fiery sparks. Beyond it, in the chamois garden, the trees were rustling. There was a noise of running feet behind them, fierce shouts. In the wall of the sepulchral chamber, the stone figures watched motionless, and behind the three fugitives the rock door fell with a resounding crash. A heart-throb too late. The end of Section 59. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 60 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. That was their salvation. As they fled on, objects on either side glided by like ghosts. Stumbling, falling, picking themselves up again, they ran along by the roaring waters of the stream. Fresh air blew upon them. Stars glittered. The clam. "On still! On!" cried the hunter. "If they get us, they'll tear us in pieces." "They would do right," groaned Peter, his throat parched. And Earl shouted and blubbered, calling on the names of the saints. The torch was nearly extinguished, but they found their way through the ravine and hurried, sick with horror, up the narrow winding path. At the top they all dropped suddenly on the ground. Gasping horribly for breath, Federspiel tore open his shirt collar. There was froth on his lips. "I'm dying." Peter tried to help him by raising him up. "Where's the boy? And Earl?" The hunter's breath whistled. Peter looked round. The boy had vanished. "And Earl!" he called. "And Earl!" No one answered. The torrent roared in its deep bed. "Good heavens, that's a bit of bad luck," muttered Federspiel, half raising himself and trying to shout with his weak voice. "And Earl!" His head sank heavily. In mortal fear Peter waited until the hunter should recover a little. What if their pursuers were still to overtake them? "He's off to tell the priest," groaned Federspiel. "Are we to blame for it?" Peter was about to shout again, but the sick man restrained him. "It's no use," the latter said quietly. "They might hear us. We can do nothing now." What was it that the old man said?" Peter burst out. "He spoke Romansch, did he not speak Romansch? You must have understood it." Federspiel nodded. "I understood everything," and in a faint voice he continued. "The darkness gathers, night comes, the cold begins, God dies. That was what the old man said. When the Sun Maiden loses her purity, God dies. We are doing no good with this. We must get on before the priest gets to work." He rose with an effort, breathing heavily. "We must warn her." "Warn?" asked Peter. "You go on down to the village," said the hunter, "and wait there for the smith, for the lady. You saved the young lady. I must go and look for old Blasi. I will have to risk it. In the morning the priest will be here with the peasants after him. I am sure of that." And as Peter still hesitated, he added grimly, "I'm not going to look on while they are butchering little Silvana." Peter suddenly realized the danger which threatened Julia. "I'm going," he said. "I will wait for her." They shook hands, each of them making a silent vow, and separated. Peter ran down the path. His heart was crushed with fear. Would she have taken another path, and have reached the smith's house before him? He reached the empty street of the village and the house. The windows were in darkness, and the door shut fast. He took up a stone and flung it at the pane of her window, smashing the glass. Then all was silent. As he turned away from the house, he noticed a dark figure in front of the rose. There was a low growl. "Who is that?" he called. In the clear night air he saw that it was a woman. A dog beside her showed white teeth. He started. "You!" he exclaimed. "Yes, it is I," said Notberger. "They sent word my brother was dead, and I have to look out for what belongs to me." "And the child?" he said. His heart seemed to stop beating. "The child, the little baby would not stay with a sinner like me," she said in a stifled voice. "There's nothing between us now, Herr Stock." "I have done you a great wrong." "Crying over it doesn't help," she answered calmly, "and God has pardoned me." "Will you live here again?" he asked. "Only for a little. I'm going to marry Zogeli Dürfel, and he's coming here. He has forgiven me for all that has happened, and I'll make him a good wife." "And this is old Butz," said Peter, reaching out his hand to the dog, who drew back with a suspicious growl. "He never liked me," he added sadly. "And you too no longer, Notberger." "I belong to another man," she said, holding out her hand. "And now, God bless you. It isn't right for us to be together. Farewell." She turned towards the inn. The door jarred, but she came back, took his head in both her hands, and kissed him on the mouth. Her cheek was wet. The house door closed heavily behind her. The end of section 60. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 61 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 61. He stood gazing at it, then roused himself with a start. Julia! Here he stood, gazing into the past, and perhaps in the morning a wild murderous mob would come. He walked a short distance up the road by which Julia must come. Cicadas chirruped round him. The stars shone clear in the vault of the heavens. How beautiful the night was, and how full of horror and fear. His feet were as if weighted with lead. His head ached. His eyes burned. The pale moon looked down, indifferent. Ah, to be away from this place, away from this valley of terror, but not without her. No, never without her. There was a sound of steps, and Peter was at once on the alert. Something bright flashed in front of his eyes. "Dog!" shouted a hoarse voice. Peter just avoided the thrust. Quick as lightning he had stepped aside and seized with all his strength the hairy paw holding the knife. "I want to save you, man," he cried. "And above all you, Julia. Listen." The smith freed himself by a slight movement, and Peter was able to see the ravages of grief in the man's hairy face. Beside him stood Julia, her head bowed. In great haste Peter related what had happened, how he and Federspiel had listened to the service, and how the lad who had stolen after them had run off. He told the smith, who listened with a grim face, that Federspiel had gone to warn Blasi. They must escape, or else prepare for the worst in the morning. "All is the same now," said Fentor gloomily. "All's over." "Well, do as you will, then," cried Peter in despair. "But you, Julia, you will stay with me." She did not answer, and stood pale and still in the moonlight. Peter looked in perplexity at the smith. "You hate me." "It has all happened because I thought the fire spirits had murdered my uncle." "What now, then, when you have yourself seen him die in the midst of the fire spirits, as you call them? What do you think now?" "Then the old man?" Peter staggered, caught his hand to his forehead, and looked at Julia. She nodded silently. "Oh, Julia, why did you not trust me?" he cried. Why not, Julia?" The smith laughed harshly. "The way was marked for you in an old book, Herr Peter Stork, but you were the kind of man who couldn't keep it to yourself, and told others. So you didn't succeed in reaching us, and you brought ruin on those who serve the light. Friend to you I'll never be. The lady here may do as she pleases. If she'll come with me and the brethren into the Engadine, she'll have to return at once on the road we've come by. If she chooses to remain in your care, it's all one to me. The sacred fire is out, and needs no one any longer to keep it. She, out of whose hands it fell, may live with men now, like other women." He thrust Peter aside and went towards his house. "Julia!" cried the young man again. As she stood there, like a statue in the clear light of the moon, and returned no answer, he was seized with despair. He caught her arm and drew her along with him towards Zeitlinghof. "You'll stay with me, Julia," he burst out, "until the storm which is certain to come has blown over, and tomorrow, as soon as it is dark, you shall leave this terrible neighborhood with me." A sob broke from her. "Father!" He felt that her heart was sore, and that she needed to rest after the dreadful scene in the Mithra grotto. He felt a faint assurance that she trusted him, but no word to her now, no questions. His own heart seemed dead within him. Even feeling was extinguished. Shadows, faint and unreal, flitted through his mind. Notburger, the dog, dreams. They were phantoms of the night, spectres which would dissolve at the first flush of dawn. Julia was beside him, leaning heavily on his arm. Her feet stumbled on stones, and she tottered forward, her eyes closed. He took her up in his arms and carried her through the disordered autumn garden, past the figure of death, watching silently beside the door, and up the staircase, which creaked as he mounted it with his burden. He laid the motionless body on his bed. Her breath came quietly, and now and then, in her sleep, she uttered a low sob like a child. He bolted all the doors and placed on the table a loaded musket ready for use. Then he went out again into the moonlight. The stars were fading. The smith came back from his house, and seeing Peter standing in the garden, walked up to him and threw down a bundle on the ground. "Clothes," he said in a voice like distant thunder. "Clothes and things that belong to the young lady." Peter took the bundle, and involuntarily put his hand on a sack on the man's shoulder. "That's mine," he said. Fentor roughly pushed away Peter's hand. "Unclean feet shall not spoil the place where the Father sleeps." He laughed bitterly. "What have you in it?" asked Peter uneasily. "You'll know, time enough." And now, young sir, don't detain me. Every word you say is like as if you put your hand into the raw flesh of a wound. And if I knew it was through you that the sacred bowl was broken—" He clenched his fists and his eyes flashed. "You may thank the daughter of the sun that I don't break you like rotten wood. She prayed for you." His formidable fists trembled, and a groan issued from his throat. Then his anger passed. "It's all one now. Nothing matters." He suddenly burst into tears. With quaking shoulders he passed Peter and stamped heavily up the road. "His God is dead," thought Peter, looking after him. "Dead." He took up the bundle and carried it into the house, then closed the door softly and laid it in the room where she slept. His restlessness drove him out of doors again. He had to wait a long time for Federspiel. "I found Blasi," said the hunter. "At first he wanted to have my life, but I kept him off, and at last was able to talk to him. He is out of his wits now, laughing and crying together." He sat down beside Peter at the side of the road. "Well, we have carried out our plan, and now, when it's too late, I find that without knowing it, I have all my life been one of the fire spirits myself. Yes, I too have worshipped the sun every day. It was a priest whom we saw dying, and I found my uncle after all. Saw him for the first and the last time," returned Peter. "Neither of us brings a blessing with him, Herr Federspiel. We have done what we set out to do, and while I have been securing the poor little thing from those rascals, who will be here in an hour or two like wild bulls, you, I suppose, have not been sleeping." "She is at my house," said Peter, "and tomorrow at dusk I leave this place forever. And you, Herr Federspiel, you will come with us. There's plenty of room in my house in Vienna." The hunter laughed constrainedly. "I in Vienna? You don't believe it yourself, Herr Stork. Something else is in store for me here. I know it. Thank you. You are good-hearted. No, don't talk to me. I stay where I am. I know well what is going to happen, and compared with it, this rising of peasants against the sun-worshippers will be child's play, and soon over. They'll find no one now in the caves, and to the dead they can do nothing. And now, Herr Stork, we'll try to rest for an hour or so. The moon has set already, and soon the god will be here whom they think dead. He dies every year, and grows pale and paler, till he comes to the turn of winter, and puts on his girdle of gold." He rose, pressed Peter's hand, and went off to his hut. The first timid cries of birds were heard. A thin rosy streak appeared in the east. "There is still time," murmured Peter, who could hardly keep his eyes open. He stole softly through the garden and took off his shoes as he entered the house. In his uncle's chair, with his face toward the slowly brightening window, he gazed with aching eyes at the rising day. The end of section 61. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 62 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 62. A wild uproar, above which sounded a penetrating voice, roused him with a start from a light sleep. He quickly closed all the doors and went down to the village. They were here. They had come up from the valley, as the hunter had foretold, and the Cinq-Marin people mingled excitedly with the armed bands. The Capuchin's red beard was wagging, and his fists were stretched out of the sleeves of his brown cloak. "Now we know all," cried Father Archangelus, and his powerful voice sounded like a trumpet. "The reason is plain why it was that in the parish church down yonder the sweetheart of Jesus shed tears of blood for all to see. Now we know why God is angry, and has withdrawn his hand from Tyrol, and given it over to its foes for chastisement. Vain have been the tears and prayers of your priests. Vain are fervent supplications to Saint Joseph our country's patron. What, then, is amiss with us? What is amiss with this Catholic country?" He lowered his arms and looked fiercely at the crowd. "Our Christian religion is shamed, our Lord and Saviour insulted. The Blessed Virgin Mary has turned away her face from us with bitter tears. Horrors have happened in these mountains, heathenish, hellish horrors, filth of Satan. The holy sacrifice of the Mass is turned to mockery by a heathen priest. Naked whores dance in front of idols. Creatures in the shape of devils wander about in this place. 3 Christian men have looked on shuddering while Satan's Mass was being celebrated in a cave. Andreas," he shouted, "come forward and bear witness." The crowd parted, and Anderl came forward trembling. His clothes were torn, his hands gashed with thorns. In a quaking voice he related how he, with Herr Stork and Seraphim Federspiel, had seen the devils descending, and how the 3 had followed them. He told everything: the flute playing, the shameless dancing, the coloured lights, the chalice, the bread, the hymns. The crowd listened in wild excitement. "Now, Andreas," ordered the Capuchin, "name the members of this unhappy parish who took part in this idolatry." Slowly, timidly, the names were uttered. "Ventor the smith, his brother the charcoal burner, the pitch gatherer, the young lady, the rover, he was their head." "Therefore God has overthrown him," shouted the monk furiously. "Up now, you Christian people, and make an end of heathenism. Enough has been told you." The anger of the crowd blazed into a frenzy. In a twinkling the circle of listeners had broken up, and in a confused rabble they rushed to the smithy. Peter stepped forward quickly to the zealot. "Father, what are you doing? You will bring great unhappiness. The people up there have done no harm to anybody." The red-bearded priest looked at him out of the corners of his eyes. "Take care," he hissed. "I warn you." Peter understood well enough, realizing his helplessness. A word from this man in the brown cloak might mean death, and then Julia too would be lost. The door of the smithy stood firm for a while, till they found a crowbar, and the oaken boards were soon battered in. With loud yells the crowd poured into the deserted house, smashing glass and throwing out into the street window frames, feather beds, cupboards, chests, crockery. The smith was nowhere to be seen. "I appeal to you once more," said Peter, turning to the clergyman, enraged by this senseless destruction. "I know very well that you are not a true Christian," returned the other harshly, and his freckled face darkened. "I am not responsible for your soul, but I am for the souls of these people. Once more, do not try to hinder me." A woman emerged from the house with a crucifix. She caressed the Saviour with her hand, saying,
"Isn't that better? You will be well off with me. You will have a light always. Ah, your pain must have been 10 times worse in that accursed house."
"Now for the heathen sorcerers! Up to the charcoal burners! Burn the witch!" They formed once more into a band. "Andreas!" cried the father. "Lead on!" And with the lad as their guide they rushed off up the mountain, the priest with his crucifix at their head. Peter stayed behind. He heard a titter beside him. It was Gisselle's old wife.
"Oh, the fools!"
1,000 wrinkles moved about her mocking lips.
"They want to destroy the secret ones who live in the mountain, but they have no more power than the crucified God. And I saw myself the way Donner threw his hammer into the church below in the valley, and it went up in bright fire, because he was stronger than the other, and he won't be able to help the Tyrolese, the God on the cross."
She went off, mumbling to herself. With hurried steps Peter went to his house. He brushed aside Herlander, who was standing at her wit's end before the locked door of his room, and entered. "Julia," he called softly, "are you awake?" He opened the door of the bedroom. She came towards him, in one of the dresses which the smith had brought, foreseeing what would happen in his own house. There were deep shadows under her eyes, and her face was white. Soothingly, moved by a deep love, he stroked her hair. She burst into tears and flung her arms about him. He refrained from troubling her with questions, and brought her some milk and bread, telling her as much as was necessary of the morning's doings. "In the evening we will leave this house," he said, "and this country, Julia."
"Where am I to go?" she wept. "I have no longer anyone."
"Are you not my wife?" She looked at him and trembled. A light blush spread over her face.
"I am yours."
The end of Section 62. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 63 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 63. Then, at first hesitatingly, but soon finding relief in escaping from a prolonged restraint, she began to speak. The actress of the Kartnetor Theatre at Vienna, who had disappeared after the scene between Peter's uncle and the French prince, had been her mother. In a little village in a valley of the Engadine, her home, the woman had brought Martin Stork's child into the world in poverty and misery. A letter in which the frivolous creature, after some years, implored help from the lover she had deceived, at length told him her whereabouts. He sent a confidential messenger who was charged to offer her a sufficient sum of money on condition that she would give up the little girl and send her to him. The actress, whose real name was Avori, had without hesitation consented, and handed over the child, who, left wholly to herself, had been growing up among children who spoke the Romansk dialect. Martin Stork had at once taken to his heart the pretty child, and had caused her to be educated carefully at Innsbruck, appearing himself once every year in the little capital, that he might see that everything possible was done for his daughter's welfare. At the recollection of the loving care of the father whom she had so recently lost, Julia burst into fresh tears, and it was some time before Peter ventured to question her further. "Poor child," he said, comforting her and stroking her hair. "How little joy you must have had in your childhood." She started up, looking at him with shining eyes. "Little joy! If you knew how happy my noble father's love made me, and how great was my joy when he allowed me to spend my summers in Saint Miraine and to be near him. It was he who unlocked for me the treasures of his knowledge, and let my soul drink of his wisdom. I could never tell how good he was to me." "You were here, then, in Zeitlenhof?" Peter asked, surprised. She shook her head. "No. He did not allow it. Only the smith knew that I was his daughter. He had complete confidence in Fentor, at whose house I lived. The people in the village had no suspicion of our real relationship." "Strange," said Peter. "And yet you held one of the highest and most sacred dignities of the Mithra Brotherhood." She covered her eyes with her hand. Peter took her arm gently. "Be a brave girl, and tell me everything," he entreated. Her face was troubled. "There was a change," she said, as if to herself. "What change?" he urged, eager for the key to the mystery which still surrounded her. "I knew nothing of these things when I spent the first summer at Saint Miraine," she continued. "It was only in the second year that I noticed that my father had become more silent and grave, and often looked at me mysteriously. Then I was very anxious when he began to stay out all day on the mountains with the smith and old Blasi, and when he came back, several times he said strange things which filled me with anxiety, called himself Emilianus, and said that he had lived in this place 2,000 years ago and had belonged to the worship of the unspotted god. And once it frightened me to see a hard light in his eyes, always so kind. It was as if someone else were looking out of them, a merciless, wicked person. In those days he began to speak Romansk, which I had known well from my childhood. Fentor, the charcoal burner, and Blasi understood it also, and it was these two who persuaded my father to set about restoring the old faith, which had never been quite extinct, for every year its festivals were celebrated.
They were absolutely convinced that my father was a priest of the Mithra, come to life again, the same Aemilianus Sagittarius whose image you saw in the sepulchral chamber. One day my father was quite overcome. He was sitting with me in the wood where we had been looking for berries and mushrooms, and suddenly his eyes grew fixed and large, and he uttered words that filled me with horror. "He that is in me wills it. He that is in me constrains me." And then he fell in a faint on the grass. I cried out and wept, and at last the old pitch-gatherer came and brought him to himself again.
She shuddered at this remembrance and wrung her hands. "And then, for your father's sake, you too attended the nightly worship?"
"Yes,"
she answered.
"The old faith of Mithra suddenly revived when the word was passed that a father had returned from the dead. For believers to give that name to the priest who transmutes the bread and the sacred wine, and who alone may kindle the sun fire. Before this, little companies of the faithful had walked in the secret paths at the times of the equinox, disguised partly as devils, so as to frighten away the inquisitive. Fire spirits, these light-bearers were called by the people. But now in a short time the sun-worshippers grew to hundreds. The sun-maiden only was wanting. Then my father took me, bade me put on a white robe, and conducted me to the grotto. They kissed the hem of my robe, and from that time I was surrounded with love and veneration, and I carried the vessel containing the sacred fire to the Father on the days of the great festival."
"And about me? Did your father never say anything about me?" interjected Peter, grieved a little. She smiled.
"He was always speaking of you,"
she said, gazing at him.
"It was when he had changed, and the other, as he said, was in him, that your name was often on his lips. 'The way is marked out for him in the book,' he said once to Fentor and me. 'He will find it.' Fentor did not approve, but he was accustomed to yield. After this my father's state grew worse. Only at intervals was he free from the idea that he was a Roman tribune. Perhaps he was uneasy about it himself, or why should he secretly have left a gift for you in his desk? He must have had a foreboding that his spirit would grow darker and more disturbed. And one day he did not come back. He went into the mountains and never after that returned. I waited for him in deadly fear, and at last in the evening Fentor and Blasi announced to me solemnly that the Father was now united to God and must remain close to the sacred places. I might see him in Blasi's hut. I went up there and saw him, and found with horror that the delusion had taken complete possession of him. Long before this, however, he had exacted a solemn oath from me that if you should ever come to Saint Marain, I would never tell you of anything that concerned him. When it was God's will, you would find the way to him."
"And yet he crossed my path twice," exclaimed Peter.
"He could not resist the longing to see you. He loved you so much, and he often said that you were the only one left of his blood and name, and that even as a child in the cradle you had shown an affection for him. But whenever you were near, the power of the other soul that was in him weakened."
"Oh, if only you had trusted me, Julia!" cried Peter. She bowed her head.
"It was impossible. I was bound by my oath. Almost every day the smith reminded me of my promise. He hated you, Peter, and suspected that you would never rest until you had found your uncle. It was he who left that warning at your window in the inn. Blasi and he spread the report that my father had met with an accident in the mountains, and no one troubled himself about the stranger who lived in the pitch-gatherer's hut. And even if they had looked into his altered face, they would never have taken him for the handsome Martin Stork, with his long white beard and kindly eyes."
"Strange, strange," muttered Peter.
"And once,"
her voice faltered,
"once my father was seized with pains in the chest. He had often before suffered from this complaint, and I asked Silvana to fetch the pills which he took for it. They were in your study, as I knew well. She was afraid of the dog, and would not venture, so I came myself. You were sleeping, and the moon was shining on your face. You were smiling, and then—" She was silent. "Then you kissed me." He pressed his lips to her mouth. Then he said hurriedly, "Your religion was pure. How did it happen that a little wench like Sylvana was allowed to take part in the sacred rites?" Julia lowered her eyes. "Many were against her," she answered softly, "but the father was indulgent towards her, and often took delight in her childish liveliness, and his word was law. Even though many were displeased, no one would have dared to rebel against him, and so she was admitted to the lowest grade among the ravens. Oh, and by this time—" Once more she was overcome by a fit of silent weeping. Peter sat beside her without moving, took her small hand in his own, and waited patiently. "Well, the riddles are all answered now," he said presently, "and I have only one wish, dear Julia, that we may escape from this gloomy neighbourhood to pleasanter surroundings." She did not answer, but pressed close to him. "I will go with you," she whispered. "I loved you from the first time I saw you. I love you now, and will always love you." A terrible crash caused them both to start up. The mountains took up the thundering sound, tossing it to and fro between them. The windows rattled as if before a sudden and frightful blast of wind. In dismay they looked toward the mountain. 2 greyish-yellow clouds of dust mounted in the air, then spread out. One issued from behind the summit of the shellbock, the other wreathed upwards out of the clam like a dragon. "It's Ventor!" cried Julia. "He has blown up the grotto!" The end of section 63. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 64 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 64. In the afternoon the peasants returned, disappointed and exhausted. The Capuchin was with them. They had failed to set foot in the places which had been consecrated to the worship of the sun god. A frightful explosion which knocked down those who were in advance and choked up the passages with debris made all approach impossible. Brown-stained water burst, seething down through the clam amid tumbled fragments of the vaulted roof. Never again would anyone living tread the paths by which the fire spirits had gone. In other respects the expedition had been unsuccessful. The pitch-gatherer's hut stood empty, with open doors, and the poor and scanty furniture tempted no one to take the trouble to destroy it. The charcoal burner's hut likewise was forsaken, and in the middle of it, fashioned out of bark and red tree fibre, a caricature image with cowl and foxy beard was so recognizable that a young fellow shouted loudly, "Father Archangelus!" Towards evening the crowd melted away. About the ruined house of the smith feathers from the torn beds were still whirling in the wind. The village lay still as death, and people kept within their houses in anxiety and dismay, frightened still further by the strange talk of old Gisselle's wife. None could tell how great might be the power of the god who had been so affronted. By the wall of the churchyard, a girl in a dark dress and with golden hair, closely followed by a black dog, gazed at the gravedigger as he shovelled earth into Christiane's unconsecrated grave. Every now and then she raised her handkerchief to her eyes, and then the dog would utter a short, plaintive whine. A black woodpecker tapped at a tree beside the charnel house with a quick succession of pecks, which made a sound like the muffled beating of a drum. And later, in the clear night, a carriage drew up at a point in the road down in the valley, where no houses were to be seen. 2 persons entered, a third stood at the carriage door. "Once more, Herr Federspiel, come with us to Vienna," said Peter Stork. "No, it can't be," returned the hunter. "I must stay a little while, and it will be over. Farewell, and may you be truly happy, you and your lovely bride. Adieu, adieu."
The words soon were lost in the wind, which lifted the man's hair as he stood for a long time with his hat in his hand, looking after the carriage. The sound of the wheels grew fainter and died away, but the trotting of the horses was heard for some time longer in the still night. Then all was silent round Federspiel. "I'm alone again now," he said, clenching his teeth. "The good time is over." He coughed and walked slowly up the road to St. Maraine. The end of section 64. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 65 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 65. The marriage was celebrated on November 2, 1809. The day was dark and cheerless, with drizzling rain, but in the old house zum alten Blumenstockel, branching silver candelabra lit up the white table, and the candles burned with a golden flame. Glasses sparkled, and from the bouquet of white roses in Julia's hand hung broad ribbons, apple green and peach red. Bartenstein, the Franconian, had come up from Würzburg, and Peter's friends had gathered. The delicate notes of a spinet and a chorus of tuneful voices greeted the bride and groom as they entered. A tear glistened on the bride's cheek. "Do not weep, dearest," whispered Peter in her ear. "He whom we both mourn is looking down on us and blessing our union." A little girl, dressed in bright blue silk, with flaxen hair, curtsied prettily, and held before the bridal pair a silver tray, on which were 2 green rummers filled with sparkling Rhine wine. Peter shuddered as he reached out his hand. "Listen," he said, "there was a shot." The guests gathered round, laughing and jesting. "He's still fighting on Pontlat's bridge," said Bartenstein. "I drink to you, brother." The glasses clinked together with a thin, clear sound like a distant peal of bells. The end of section 65. Recording by Andy Sames. Section 66 of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 66. At the same hour, at the head of a strong column, General Rechberg was riding towards the bridge over the upper Inn. A young captain of the French regiment of chasseurs, mounted beside him on a restless white horse, was looking up at the slopes which rose from the river beside the road. Behind the 2 horsemen walked the guide, 2 men with fixed bayonets on either side of him. He was an old peasant, in a dirty red jacket, thin and meagre, and with a repulsive appearance. He had no nose. His thin lips were drawn back from his teeth in a set grin, and his deep sunken eyes looked out of their hollows with a piercing gaze. A stray dog which accompanied the soldiers ran up to him, sniffed at his thin shanks, then howled suddenly and made off along the road in front of them, its tail between its legs. "Pardon, General," said the young captain to Rechberg. "Is this the spot where these cowardly rebels inflicted that shameful reverse on Colonel Bechid?" The Bavarian general surveyed the talkative young man contemptuously. "Perhaps, Captain, your judgment would be different if you were to come to close quarters with the sharpshooters of this country. We now prefer to hope that we Bavarians may at last succeed in winning the confidence of a brave people." "Bavarians!" the Frenchman laughed, pursing his lips. "Considering that our Dalmatian and Italian regiments have a notion of occupying this country, it's questionable whether we are going to hand it over to the Bavarians. The Emperor will decide what is to be done with these goat herds." The general bit his lip and bent his head. "The shame of it," he said to himself. "Must I put up with such insolence?" An angry retort rose to his lips. At this moment, at a bend of the road near the fatal bridge, a man appeared from behind the leafless bushes and stood motionless in the middle of the road. Involuntarily the 2 officers pulled up their horses. The man had a curious appearance. His cheeks were sunken, the skin was tight over his cheekbones, and his feverish eyes flashed like blue flames. His slovenly clothes were torn and neglected. A musket hung on a faded band over his shoulder, and the tattered feathers of a blackcock fluttered in his yellow-green hat. He stood squarely and defiantly, with his face to the advancing troops, a strange smile on his pale features. The general kept his horse standing. "What's this?" asked the Frenchman, pointing towards the man with his gold-knobbed riding-rod. "A rebel, putting in an appearance in your honour," answered the general, scowling. The captain laughed loudly and put spurs to his horse, which reared and dashed forward. Then he advanced at a smart trot towards the man, flicking his rod carelessly. With a supercilious face looking down out of half-closed eyes, he pulled up his horse a step or two in front of the Tyrolese, and still flicking his riding-rod, said shortly, "Rends-toi, Canel." The emaciated man shouted a laugh, and, quick as lightning, brought his musket into position. A yellow tongue of fire flashed out in blue smoke. The Frenchman uttered a squeal like that of a hurt cat, and fell heavily from his horse, with his face in the mud of the mist-soaked road. The general rode forward and shouted, but without any order from him, a crackle of shots broke from 10-20 muskets. The assailant collapsed without uttering a sound, and his blood streamed in the cool air. The dead man had been alone, and was a poor, sick creature, formerly a student named Seraphine Federspiel. The End of The Fire Spirits by Paul Busson, translated by J. Eglinton. Recording by Andy Sames.